Good, how about you? Yeah, it's got that stuff. Great to see you. Good. It's a big day.
Good morning. Good morning. Oh, man, I haven't been working out that much, and I still, wow. Okay. Good morning. The subcommittee will come to order. The chair recognizes himself for an opening statement. Again, good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing titled NIL Playbook, Proposal to Protect Student Athletes, Dealmaking Rights. Last year, our subcommittee held an educational hearing on this topic of name, image, likeness in collegiate athletics, where we heard from student athletes, university presidents, athletic directors, and others involved in this rapidly growing field. On the heels of this season's college football national championship game, where the University of Michigan Wolverines defeated the University of Washington Huskies, there has never been a better time to address this topic. And I will tell you, it was a hell of a game. I think the Huskies played a lot better during the semifinal game. But I want to, yeah, you want to do over, yeah. You just might get that next year. And I want to say congratulations again to the Wolverines and the Michigan fans nationwide, including my friends, and I mean, these are my good friends, Debbie Dingle and our vice chairman, Tim Wahlberg, for their victory. Congratulations. I wanted to be clear today, NIL is great for players, and the change was long overdue. At the same time, the sudden transition to NIL has enabled a Wild West environment where pay for play is rampant. I don't think anybody can argue that that's not true. The purchasing of players has set college athletics on an unsustainable path, in my opinion. To ensure a long-term future for college athletics, we must promote safe guardrails and a level playing field. There's no doubt that Congress needs to act. Unfortunately, the NIL landscape is complicated because the NCAA created many of the problems to begin with and has since struggled to get a handle on this evolving landscape. Now, to be fair, the current president who is here today, he's new to this, and he's trying to fix it, and he's been working with us on a regular basis, and I appreciate that so very much. I'm certainly among those who have been concerned with some of the associations, however, the association's recent activities, while supportive of others, and I look forward to hearing from President Baker's testimony. As money has poured in from boosters, collectives, and corporate entities to purchase players for their favorite team, small schools and non-revenue generating sports are often forgotten. Meanwhile, I believe we are losing sight of the educational opportunities and values that defines the student experience in universities across our nation. Some have further advocated for students as employees or for forced revenue sharing schemes, both of which have the potential to end many women's sports programs and significantly reduce our Olympic pipeline. In the 2020 Tokyo Games, almost 82% of American medalists had direct ties to a collegiate program. So while the courts have settled the debate on NIL compensation broadly, it has become necessary for Congress to step in and provide some common sense rules of the road. And I believe that that's what we've done with this discussion draft. Again, this is a discussion draft. Today, we are considering my discussion draft, as I said, proposal, the Fair College Sports Act. The goal of this bill is to establish a clear set of rules so that young people are protected, opportunities for them promoted, and amateur sports of all kinds are preserved, and does so without expanding government. And this is what this draft does. Again, we want to file the bill as soon as possible. And again, I've been working with Ms. Dingle, and she hasn't committed to co-sponsoring my bill, but we've been working together and following tradition of this great committee, Energy and Commerce, working in a bipartisan fashion. The Fair College Sports Act has received an open and robust stakeholder feedback process over the past 8 months. I don't believe this should be a bipartisan issue. It should be a bipartisan issue, excuse me. And I'm excited to formally begin a public discussion on NIL legislation and know that we can come together to build consensus. We can do this. We need to save college sports as we know it. I'm grateful to our former colleague, Senator Ben Ray Lujan, for his efforts to move the ball forward on this issue with me. And Ben Ray has been outstanding. We've been working with him for several weeks on the Senate side. I also particularly want to thank Representative Dingle, who has committed to working with me to find a path forward. I know she has some concerns with the current draft, and I'm sure there are issues that we won't fully agree on. But this is why we have legislative hearings and run a regular order process to discuss these matters and work on them together. And I also look forward to working with my ranking member, Jan Schakowsky, on this particular discussion draft. We're going to try to meet on a regular basis, and I want to see what issues she has with this draft, and if we can find consensus, that would be fantastic. Because the sooner we get this across the finish line, the better for our athletes. It is important to remember, again, energy and commerce is where bipartisan proposals flourish and become law. NIL should be one of those examples. I don't see why not. I also want to call out the 3 student athletes represented on the panel today: Meredith Page, Kiki Thal, and Chase Griffin. You are the reason why we do this. With a thoughtful and balanced framework, I'm confident we can provide stability to collegiate athletics while ensuring to protect athletes, promote fair play, and preserve the sports we know and love. I want to thank you for your bravery. Please don't get nervous. Just tell us how you feel about this particular issue. But really, thank you for coming forward today. It really does take a lot of bravery, and I know you'll do an outstanding job. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and I look forward to a productive discussion on this important issue, and I yield back. The gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Schakowsky, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
There we go. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm really glad to be here at this hearing and welcome all the witnesses. Again, the student athletes that are here, really want to hear from you. So we're talking right now about college athletics. And we know that it is now college sports are really a multi-billion-dollar industry. The money is generated by the student athletes who actually from their institutions get nothing in terms of compensation. And I want to say a special welcome to the hearing of our NCAA president, Charlie Baker. I know that he's pretty new to this job, and I appreciate the conversations that we've been able to have at the beginning of when you came and just this week. But I do want to say that I appreciate, Mr. Chairman, what you're saying, that we are talking about a discussion draft right now, and that it is very important that we work together on a bipartisan basis to come up with a final conclusion. And I really do look forward to these these conversations, and wish we had even begun even sooner on that. But here we go. I believe in this conversation that we have to make the rights and privileges and protection of student athletes to be number one. Today, right now, the only way that college athletes can get any resources based on name and image and likeness is from third-party players, so the third-party companies. So, we may want to have a conversation about that as well. I was involved with some students at Northwestern University some years ago in 2015 when they were talking about unionization. And I actually stood with them because they were concerned about healthcare issues as well as compensation issues. That was not successful, but I credit them for organizing around these issues, and we need to listen to the student athletes as we begin our effort. And let me just say that I think there are a couple of things that we ought to really pay most attention to, and that will be medical coverage. And I know that that Charlie has paid attention to those issues, and I appreciate that. The health and safety standards, the rights to collective bargaining. I do want to have that conversation as we go forward. And strong Title IX enforcement. We want to make sure the equity between the genders, et cetera, is very, very important. So I really, really do look forward to enforcing some of the health and safety provisions that have to be made really, really clear and universal for our students, our student athletes. And I think we will have a robust discussion today and look forward to coming up with legislation, although, in some cases I wonder why Congress is better than sometimes the courts themselves are better in protecting our students. But we'll be working in a bipartisan basis, and that's the most important thing. And with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I look forward to working with her. And now I recognize the chair of the full committee, my good friend, Mrs. Rodgers, for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. And I want to take a moment to thank Chair Bilirakis for his exhaustive process over the past year to bring parties together. Recognize my colleagues, Representative Dingell and Senator Lujan, an alum of this committee, for their work with Chair Bilirakis to find a path forward on this important issue. Every one of us takes pride in the universities and colleges in our home states, and we all want our student athletes to be successful both on and off the field. Today's hearing is the next step in our regular order process. This is an opportunity to continue the dialogue, address outstanding concerns, and hear from the student athletes who will benefit most from a clear set of uniform rules and protections. To ensure that amateur athletes have every chance to succeed in life and in sports, we must give them clear guidance. Today, we have the opportunity to hear from several of those athletes. Ms. Meredith Page, a Division I volleyball player at Radford University. Kiki Thrall, a member of the University of Michigan softball team. And Mr. Chase Griffin, a football player at UCLA. And we appreciate you being here to share your stories with us. Your experience navigating this complex topic is critical as members work to refine the discussion draft under consideration. The current patchwork of state laws is confusing for athletes, schools, and conferences alike, and it's unreasonable to expect student athletes to balance their studies while navigating this maze of complex and conflicting laws. They are put in an unwinnable position of running afoul of rules they would need a law firm to provide counsel on. This can be detrimental to their educational experience as well as their savings and future career. I recently heard about a draft NIL agreement with a collective which agreed to pay an athlete $1.5 million over 2 years. Hidden in the fine print was a provision which allowed the collective, quote, from time to time, to ask for repayment of that money plus a 10% interest for commission and expenses. These provisions applied even if that agreement were to be terminated. This behavior is abhorrent, predatory, and is exactly what we're trying to prevent with this legislation. With one national standard, we can shield student athletes from such bad actors, provide transparency into the evolving NIL marketplace, and allow athletes to focus on succeeding on the field and in the classroom. We need to get this right in order to protect the rights of millions of young Americans who continue receiving an education and competing in the sports they love. Furthermore, while some sports at the highest level are profitable, for most student athletes competing in sports, it's a non-revenue generating endeavor. Many of these programs continue to be paths for students pursuing higher education and for some to even represent our country to the world. For instance, in the 2020 Tokyo Games, over 80% of the U.S. medalists had ties to a collegiate program, with more than 170 U.S. institutions of higher learning being a training ground for the Olympians. Some proposals currently being discussed, along with the uncertainty created by a patchwork of state laws, jeopardize these opportunities for young people and could prevent them from accessing a college degree program. It would mean that many small schools, including historically black colleges and universities and others, could be forced to eliminate their sports programs altogether. Our proposal would ensure these programs are preserved for student athletes across the country. These collegiate athletes are more than just athletes. They're students, small business owners, podcasters, entrepreneurs, and more. They deserve clear guidelines and transparency. NIL is a long overdue means of compensation for student athletes across the country. Every student athlete deserves the opportunity to succeed in their sport and in life. There are many other important conversations currently happening in collegiate sports that aren't necessarily specific to the issue of NIL, for instance, Title IX, which other committees are actively engaging on. As we continue this discussion, I encourage all of my colleagues, House and Senate, as well as stakeholders, to work with us in providing the best protections and opportunities possible for our student athletes. Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the chairwoman, and now I recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it comes to college athletics and name, image, and likeness, NIL, I believe our focus should be on what is best for students. For far too long, college athletes, unlike any other student, faculty member, or coach, were prohibited by the NCAA from profiting from their own name, image, and likeness. And thankfully, that has finally changed, and I have not heard a single good argument for why Congress should erode a college athlete's newly acquired NIL rights. Unfortunately, the discussion addressed before us today would significantly restrict college athletes' NIL rights and cement the NCAA's monopolistic control over players. This committee should be working to preserve athletes' NIL rights. We should also work to establish health and safety protections that ensure players are guaranteed coverage for athletic-related medical expenses and to provide baseline player health and safety standards. And we should strengthen Title IX protections and uphold college athletes' First Amendment right to organize. Instead, the Republican committee leadership has chosen to take up a discussion draft that would do more harm for college athletes than good, in my opinion. Now, I wanted to split my remaining time between two colleagues, Representative Trahan and Representative Dingell. And so I'll initially yield 2 minutes to Representative Trahan, who is, of course, a former college athlete, as we all know.
Well, thank you, Ranking Member Pallone. I'm grateful to you and to Ranking Member Schakowsky for ensuring that we have witnesses that truly represent the breadth of athlete experiences in college sports today. Athletes' perspectives are extremely important. In fact, I would argue the most important, as this committee considers legislation that directly affects athletes' rights. However, as many current or former college athletes will tell you, it's their voices that are often sidelined in conversations about the future of the multi-billion-dollar industry built on their hard work. For decades, athletes were told that the rules and policies governing their lives were in their best interests, that they were meant to protect them when they really fostered a system that rewarded everyone except those creating the value. But times have changed. Athletes have more power today than ever before, and despite what may be said by some here today, that's a good thing. I trust athletes because as a former D1 volleyball player, I know what the opportunity to play the sport you love at the school of your dreams means to you. I trust athletes because I've talked to them and I've heard their stories about sending NIL money home so that parents could pay their bills, or using it to put food on their own table when the dining hall is closed. The last thing this committee should be considering is legislation that would limit those opportunities. Instead, we should be working together to solve the real issues facing athletes today. Issues like international athletes not having NIL rights, Title IX loopholes, robbing women athletes of roster spots, and outdated health and safety standards that fail athletes. So I'm disappointed that none of those problems are addressed by the legislation featured in today's hearing, and that the majority rejected Democratic requests to include my bicameral NIL legislation, the College Athlete Economic Freedom Act. I urge my colleagues to work together to find compromise on this issue. It's more important that we get it right, rather than rush through a one-sided proposal that doesn't meet the needs of hardworking athletes. I yield back.
And now I yield the remaining time to Ms. Dingell.
Thank you, Mr. Pallone. I have to begin by saying go blue. We had a great celebration at Michigan with all of our athletes last weekend. I want to thank Kiki Thole, a University of Michigan softball player, for being here with us as a witness to give us her perspective on the intersection between college athletics and NIL. I also want to recognize a Michigan great, Carol Hutchins, Hutch as we call her, the winningest coach in the NCAA softball history. I have to say to you, one of the witnesses said, when I said Hutch came with Kiki, she said if there was a Mount Rushmore of coaches, Hutch would be one of the. And I'm lucky, because I have Hutch, Jim Harbaugh, Ward, Manuel, Scott. I have the best and the brightest minds in sports in Michigan giving me advice. And for the record, Hutch and Harbaugh don't agree. But that's why I'm lucky, because I'm listening to everybody, which is what we must do right now. And I respect and listen to all of them. As those of us from Michigan know, college sports are a big deal, and they're the lifeblood of many communities across our country. As someone who represents a significant college athlete population at schools, big and small, Michigan has 29 programs, and I want all 29 of those programs to stay there. Eastern is a very respected smaller school, but it can't pay for the sports the way a lot of others do. I am committed to crafting meaningful federal legislation that ensures all college athletes are heard, protected, and prioritized. We're here today to discuss a framework for name, image, and likeness, or NIL, and I'm here to learn. The chairman's discussion draft is a start. There are some provisions I like. He knows that, but I am concerned about others, and anybody who knows when I'm concerned, somebody knows it, including a ban on employment and the antitrust provisions. We'll need to continue working through them and add new protections that ensure important safeguards are put in place. We need to make sure all athletes are treated fairly. Female athletes are protected and supported, and that the integrity of college sports is to be maintained. I want college sports to stay college sports. I'm glad this subcommittee has begun tackling this important task, and I look forward to working with Chairman Bilirakis, all the members of this committee, yes, including a former college athlete herself, Congresswoman Trahan, on a national standard that protects and empowers college athletes. We need to get this right. We need to prioritize gender equity, health and safety, and most important, the athletes. Thank you. I'm looking forward to beginning the conversation today, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for her input. Our first witness, we'll move on. Our first witness is Governor President Charlie Baker, President of the National Collegiate Athletic Association, the NCAA. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes. We appreciate your presence here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. To you, Mr. Chairman, and to Vice Chairman Wahlberg, and to Ranking Member Schakowsky, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. Since becoming president of the NCAA nearly a year ago, I've had the privilege of meeting a countless number of the more than 500,000 student athletes we serve each year. In many ways, I've seen a system that's thriving. I've met young people for whom college has created a pathway to obtain an education that would otherwise not be available to them, and I've seen record-setting graduation rates, and I've witnessed explosive growth in women's sports, where NCAA championships often represent the pinnacle of competition. These and many other successes have deepened my conviction that college sports represents one of the world's greatest human development programs. At the same time, I've also seen the ways in which college sports have been too slow to modernize and too resistant to change, and how those failures to adapt have invited threats to its very future. That's why I took this job, to work with student athletes, our member institutions, and elected officials to forge a fair, equitable, and sustainable path forward for college sports. That work is well underway. Before answering questions this morning, 3 updates on how the NCAA is changing. First, at the NCAA, we are exhausting every option available to lead many of these long overdue reform efforts, and I want to share just a few from the past year. First, we launched an injury insurance fund that will provide student athletes from all NCAA divisions access to health insurance for athletically related injuries for up to 2 years after they graduate. That starts in August. We adopted new mandatory requirements that all Division I members offer degree completion funds for up to 10 years following the conclusion of a student athlete's eligibility, and scholarship guarantees and mandatory health and well-being services. We've also made great strides in establishing needed student athlete protections related to name, image, and likeness agreements, as evidenced by the new rules that were passed by our Division I Council just last week. And we put forward a proposal that we called Project D1 that would create a new subdivision to allow America's biggest college athletic departments to provide enhanced educational benefits and to enter directly into NIL licensing agreements with student athletes. That initial proposal is currently being further developed by the Division I Council. Second, these reforms have been developed with student athletes' needs in mind and are in their support. Each of the reforms I described were chosen based on priorities we've heard from student athlete advisory groups and are being championed by the student athletes themselves. And finally, while these reforms are popular and will prove transformative on their own, we believe they're inadequate to assure the safeguards for college sports' future. Even with the action we've taken and will continue to take, there remain threats to college sports that we lack the legal authority to address. These are narrow and few, but critically important. Specifically, they relate to improving NIL outcomes for student athletes by giving legal backing to regulations that provide, among other things, consumer protections for student athletes, such as some sort of uniform standard contract, which exists, by the way, in every other financial market in the United States that we can think of, and by giving the support that student athletes need to be able to fairly capitalize on their NIL potential and protect them from some of the existing risks of exploitation, which are absolutely out there, and ensuring compliance with Title IX. We are all in on working on ensuring compliance with Title IX, especially with respect to NIL, and that is one of the reasons why Project D1 proposed to make it possible for schools to bring NIL inside where Title IX would A, be more transparent, and B, a much more legitimate piece of how the NIL program plays out. We also want to protect and promote opportunities for student athletes by affirming that they're not employees at their universities. We believe this is critically important as we seek ways to expand benefits for student athletes in our largest athletic departments, while at the same time, without risking opportunities in women's sports, Olympic sports, Divisions 2 and 3 sports, which, by the way, make up two-thirds of all of the colleges and universities in this country, and at historically black colleges and universities who have spoken quite effectively on this issue on their own. I'm extremely grateful to all of you, and especially to the chair, for his support of college sports and for introducing draft legislation. The draft legislation has many critically important components, which includes supporting and protecting student athletes by preempting state NIL laws and addressing critical issues such as the employment status of student athletes. However, having read the legislation, we would like to be able to engage with the committee in a discussion about how to go about best implementing a model that will ensure the success of all of these great ideas and aspirations going forward. I absolutely believe that we can reach a bipartisan bill, to use the term that several have used previously, and I used to use a lot in my old job, that advances the promise of college athletics and ensures the accountability that we all believe needs to be there. I know that love of college sports runs deep within this congressional body, and I believe we all share the common goal of securing its place in our society's future, creating what I would describe as equilibrium in a world that to many currently feels completely disequilibrium. I believe, in addition to that, that we can work together to ensure that all student athletes' opportunity to compete at the highest level while getting a world-class education for years to come should be, ought to be, and can be our ultimate objective. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Our next witness is Jeff Jackson, Commissioner of the Missouri Valley Conference. Thanks for being here, sir, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and members of the committee. I want to thank you for giving myself the opportunity to testify this afternoon about this topic. For the last 2.5 years, I've had the pleasure and honor of serving as Commissioner of the Missouri Valley Conference, the second oldest collegiate conference in the Division I space in the country. Prior to that, I was an Executive Associate Commissioner of the Big 12 Conference. Prior to that, I was a Deputy Commissioner in the Big South, after a long career as a Division I men's basketball coach. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Missouri Valley, we're comprised of 12 institutions, 7 public, 5 private. We reside in the states of Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Kentucky, Missouri, and Tennessee. We serve over 4,000 student athletes, and we have 17 championships. We've had institutions from our conference play in NCAA Final Fours in recent years, participate in baseball super regionals. For many of our athletes, this is going to be their ultimate athletic experience. And for many of them, it's going to be their last athletic experience of this level of competition. And one of the things that we appreciated seeing in the discussion draft was the understanding and the appreciation of the continued tethering to the academic importance that our student athletes will need to experience. 92% of our student athletes will graduate in 6 years. This is a source of great pride for our members, and obviously the charge that we all have in the administrative space of running a conference or running an institution. You know, there's no question a couple years ago when NIL came on board, so to speak, in a conference like mine, it created some angst. It created some uncertainty in terms of where we're going to be the intended and the unintended consequences of this endeavor. But very quickly, our administrators embraced this. As a matter of fact, on several instances, we were thoroughly impressed by the entrepreneurial spirit of our student athletes. It was fantastic seeing their creativity. I remember having a conversation with one of my chancellors who happens to have a son who was a Division I athlete. And his son had called home and he was talking to the chancellor about, I got this contract and, I'm trying to figure out, do I need to pay taxes? there's an obligation clause here. If I don't do this, I don't get that. And I'm listening to this, and I'm impressed. I'm awed, because to me, we now have added another lever to creating a true student-athlete experience. Young people are learning how to manage things that are going to make a huge difference in their lives 5, 10, 15, 20 years from now. The unfortunate thing about that is that went away pretty quickly. All of a sudden, NIL wasn't NIL. It became inducement. It became ways to poach and recruit student athletes. It became fraught with fraud. We all of a sudden had a underground market in which people were pestering, harassing, reaching out to our student athletes, trying to exploit them and take advantage of the fact that there was a financial opportunity involved. No regulation, no understanding of what a legitimate agent is versus a illegitimate agent, no understanding of transparency, what was actually taking place in regards to what a student athlete's own self-value was, because there was no way to find out. And I can't thank this committee enough for taking up this topic, because it's extremely important we're able to create an atmosphere where we can, one, allow our student athletes to take advantage of their NIL, and it needs to be NIL, but also at the same time, keep them safe. So I look forward to having a great conversation about this topic. And again, I thank you for taking it up.
Thank you so much, sir. I appreciate it. Our next witness is Meredith Page, school athlete at Radford University volleyball. You're recognized for 5 minutes, and really appreciate you being here again. Thank you.
Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and distinguished members of the House Subcommittee on Innovation, Data, and Commerce, thank you for the opportunity to testify at this important hearing today. My name is Meredith Page, and I'm a junior on the women's volleyball team at Radford University, where I'm currently studying business management. Becoming a student athlete in 2021 truly changed my life. I've seen myself grow from an unsure girl to a confident woman with the empowerment of college athletics. Often a small decision leads to greater things, and I can enthusiastically say that my decision to join Radford's Student Athlete Advisory Committee, also known as SAC, was one of those momentous decisions. By the end of my freshman year, I had been named our SAC president, and my passion for student-athlete advocacy was born. Fast forward a year later, in addition to still being Radford's president, I was now the chair of the Big South Conference SAC and named the NCAA D1 SAC Big South representative. Both my institution and my conference extensively demonstrate the value they place on the student-athlete voice and have inspired me to do the same. I've been honored to be a member of the Radford leadership team, where I participate in bi-weekly meetings, share the perspective of my fellow athletes, and learn from our administrators as they navigate operating our athletic department. My exposure to the values of the Big South Conference came as I attended my first Big South Leadership Conference. The attention given to learning from their athletes at that conference demonstrated the high regard they place on the student-athlete experience. As my involvement in the conference has grown, so has the opportunities afforded to me, including a seat in conference CEOs, athletic directors, senior women's administrators, and faculty athletic representative meetings, and eventually a seat on Division I SAC. D1 SAC is dedicated to enhancing the student-athlete experience. We're comprised of one student athlete from each 32 Division I conferences, representing over 190,000 student athletes. The NCAA is dedicated to our integration into the governance structure and all leadership committees to ensure that the student-athlete voice from student athletes themselves is not lost. I'm incredibly grateful to the chairman for including protections against athlete employment status. Division I SAC is unified in your pursuit of these protections. An employment model presents many unknowns about what the future of college athletics looks like, with many questions to consider. Would institutions cut athletic programs to fund revenue-generating sports? How would this impact Title IX protections? What would happen to athletic scholarships? What does this do to the status of international student athletes? Many of these questions are at the forefront of student athletes' minds and need to be resolved before any new model is implemented, where we can finally put the emphasis back on the education, not the paycheck. The student-athlete experience prepares individuals from all walks of life to write their own story. The elimination of athletes by classification of employment would be detrimental to the framework of college athletics and the dreams of youth athletes across the country. Swimming, volleyball, tennis, and the rest on the long list of non-revenue generating sports cannot be forgotten. It's so easy to lose touch with who is behind those titles. Future doctors, lawyers, CEOs, and most importantly, the next generation of leaders. They do not deserve to get lost in the narrative. The NCAA, excelling under Charlie Baker's leadership, has taken great action to the protection of student athletes, though the effectiveness is dimmed by a patchwork of state laws. Uniformity is key. A cohesive set of rules ensures that every student athlete, regardless of their program or location, can benefit from their NIL without unnecessary complications. Guardrails to help maintain the integrity of collegiate sports while offering student athletes the chance to capitalize on their personal brand. It is not just about the present, but also about creating a sustainable and fair system for future generations of student athletes. By advocating for uniformity, we can contribute to the environment where every student athlete has equal opportunity to navigate the realm of NIL. After all, when integrity, fairness, and competitiveness of college sports deviate, the student athletes are the ones impacted. I'm eager, alongside my peers, to collaborate with you and your colleagues to ensure that the interests of student athletes are at the center of the legislative process. I greatly appreciate your attention to this matter. Thank you for your dedication to public service and your commitment to the betterment of college sports.
Thank you so very much. Next, we have our witness, Chase Griffin, who's a student athlete at UCLA. He plays football. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes. I understand you're a quarterback.
Sorry.
All right. You're recognized, sir. Appreciate it.
Good morning, Subcommittee Chair Bilirakis, Subcommittee Ranking Member Schakowsky, Chair Rodgers, Ranking Member Pallone, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. I want to thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I was born at UCLA Medical Center, Santa Monica. While I grew up a Texan, my dream was always to get back to UCLA and play football. Today, I am living my dream. While playing for Hutto High School under the Texas Friday Night Lights, I was fortunate to win Gatorade and Ford Player of the Year awards. I learned the value that my hard work could bring to brands. Most college athletes share a similar journey and bring personal brand equity, fan bases, and social media followings with them to college. I've been blessed to enter over 40 NIL deals with companies based in a dozen states. There's enough harmony among state NIL laws to seamlessly operate across the country. I also won National NIL Athlete of the Year awards from the NIL Summit in Open Doors and started the Athletes Bureau newsletter to help other athletes maximize their NIL opportunities and amplify college athlete perspectives. In my written testimony, I submitted college athlete poll results conducted by the Athletes Bureau in conjunction with the Generation Lab. Like me, most college athletes use their NIL savings for investing, saving, and building a solid financial foundation. For most of us, NIL is not Lamborghini money, but it could mean a down payment on our first homes and a new pathway to the American dream. Knowing how important NIL has been in my life, I could not in good conscience support this bill. The Fair College Sports Act creates regulatory obstacles for college athletics. This bill has over 200 negative references to NIL, with words like regulate, prohibit, sanction, restrict, and inducement, but it never mentions freedom, growth, innovation, or Title IX. NIL has gotten a bad rap in federal policymaking circles because some believe it is a nefarious pay-for-play scheme. But I ask the committee this. Colleges compete for talented computer science and engineering students with scholarships, stipends, state-of-the-art labs, and research grants to attract the top student researchers to their schools. This Congress sends nearly $100 billion a year to these colleges to fund this research. When intellectual property is developed and commercialized, student researchers share in these royalties. No one would ever say they were lured by pay for research. Because in every other aspect of American life, the expectation is that if you work hard, play by the rules, and create value, you deserve to share in that value. Why shouldn't this core American principle be true for college athletes? The Fair College Sports Act imposes onerous regulations on third-party advertisers and small businesses for working with college athletes. Craig Brommers, Chief Marketing Officer of American Eagle Outfitters, has said his company invests in NIL because it drives business results. This bill creates obstacles for what everyone considers to be true NIL. According to Open Doors, over 80% of all NIL transactions are with brands and small businesses. This part of NIL grew by 220% last year. This bill contains registration fees, monthly reporting requirements, and the threat of FTC sanctions for advertisers like JPMorgan Chase, General Motors, State Farm, Amazon, and thousands of small businesses like College Town restaurants that currently have NIL deals with athletes. In the supplemental materials, I highlighted a sample of small businesses and large businesses negatively affected in each of the subcommittee member districts. The Fair College Sports Act is especially harmful to women. 91% of women's sports compensation comes from brands and small businesses. So this bill's regulatory requirements will hurt them the most. I've appeared in campaigns alongside UCLA gymnasts and Olympian Jordan Childs with JP Morgan and Margzetta Frazier with LegalZoom, so I feel especially compelled to stand up for them. I recommend committee members talk to Title IX pioneering UCLA legend Ann Myers Drysdale about how proud she is of how women like Caitlin Clark and Angel Reese are using NIL to grow their sports. I'm sure Representative Trahan, as a former college athlete, shares Ann's sense of pride. No other industry's brand endorsers are subject to regulations like these. As a result of NIL, I've been blessed to work with Range Sports at Range Media Partners. The firm works with some of the biggest talent in Hollywood, music, and sports. Almost everyone on the roster has major brand sponsorships, but none of them are subject to the regulatory hurdles this bill would impose on college athletes. This bill codifies an outdated NCAA business model that Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh wrote would be flatly illegal in almost any other industry in America. If enacted, this bill would deprive another generation of athletes a proven and growing pathway to the American dream. Mr. Chairman, although I strongly oppose this bill, I'm still very optimistic because throughout my journey, I've found that people really want to see college athletes win, not just on game day, but in life. And I hope you will keep these sentiments top of mind as you deliberate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next witness is Caitlin Kiki Thole, a student athlete at the University of Michigan softball. And I'm not sure if you want to elaborate on that. No? Okay, because you introduced her. All right, very good. Okay, we'll recognize you, ma'am, for 5 minutes.
Subcommittee Chairman Bill Rackus, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and members of the subcommittee. I would like to begin by expressing my gratitude for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to be here in Washington to express my opinions on the ever-evolving landscape that is collegiate athletics. And a special thanks to Congresswoman Dingell, who represents the University of Michigan, for allowing me to share my name, image, and likeness experience with all of you. My name is Caitlin Thole, but most refer to me as Kiki. I'm a senior student athlete at the University of Michigan, where I'm studying business at the Stephen M. Ross School of Business. I'm a captain of the University of Michigan softball team, and I currently serve as vice president of the Student Athlete Advisory Committee. Additionally, I serve on the athletic department's advisory board for intercollegiate athletics. My testimony today represents my own personal experiences and opinions and isn't reflective on my institution, my sport, my conference, or the NCAA. NIL became allowable by the NCAA at the start of my second year of college. At the start, the rules regarding NIL were vague and unclear. Conceptually, I felt NIL was a great opportunity for student athletes, but I feared doing something wrong and not even realizing it. There were several unknowns that emerged. How do I do taxes? Who do I report these things to? How do I know a company is a good company? The spring of my sophomore year, I felt comfortable signing a contract with a company called Blue by 90, which made customized merchandise for University of Michigan student athletes. The deal was very low maintenance, and the company I worked with made me feel valued. Yet, even with the experience of one deal, I was hesitant to pursue anything much beyond this local opportunity. I felt I could not handle the workload of softball, school, social life, and managing additional NIL opportunities. Thankfully, the University of Michigan hired staff to support and educate student athletes in NIL, and U of M has identified institutional resources and a framework for student athletes to feel more confident stepping into the NIL space. For example, I've been able to work with the University of Michigan's Law School Entrepreneurship Clinic to have contracts reviewed and in one case renegotiated prior to signing NIL opportunities. As student athletes, we're not equipped to navigate legal battles with companies, nor are we likely financially able to do so. This is significant risk in the NIL space. Thus, NIL education is critically important consideration for student athletes who might not have the means to hire an agent. As at the start of my college NIL experience, the rules regarding NIL remain vague and unclear. There are still critical questions and guardrails for Congress to consider. The variety of state laws and legislative proposals seem to address the use of NIL and recruiting differently, therefore allowing some institutions to bring up NIL with a recruit. My fear in this practice is around how promises to student athletes are being made. And while I understand the notion that employment status for student athletes can mean the opportunity to share in revenue, there are significant concerns I don't fully understand the implication of. Insurance, healthcare, retirement, minimum wage, unions, pensions, salary bands, human resources. Are student athletes at-will employees? Will scholarships be removed? What wage will be offered to pay for college? How will employees be taxed? Will the athletic departments match a 401k plan? Finally, in the new NIL landscape, especially in regard to collectives, how does compliance with the principles of Title IX apply? No one seems to be sure, and thus no one is enforcing compliance. Women's sports has come so far, and yet I fear NIL can push us backwards. The goal for Congress should be to ensure an even playing field for all institutions and protect all student athletes' well-being, mentally, physically, and financially. Being able to get an education while playing a game that I am passionate about is what was and continues to be the most important to me. I am one athlete out of thousands of collegiate student athletes throughout the country. I know there are many voices that want and need to be heard. I would ask the members of Congress before me today, how many athletes have you spoken with on this topic? I encourage you all to seek out more coaches and athletes as you work to shape legislation that ultimately has the college athletic experience top of mind. Thank you again for inviting me to testify before you today so that my voice can be heard. I appreciate you allowing me the opportunity to begin a conversation which hopefully will create action and drive change.
Thank you very much. The gentlelady yields back. Our final witness is Dr. Victoria Jackson, Associate Clinical Professor of History at Arizona State University. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Chair Belrakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to speak with you all. My name is Victoria Jackson, and I'm Associate Clinical Professor of History at Arizona State University. I'm a former college track and field athlete, national champ, and retired professional runner. Now I teach sports history, including a course on the history of American college sports. For my oral testimony, I would like to highlight 3 points, and I can answer questions about my written testimony as well, of course. But first, we are talking about many different things when we say name, image, and likeness, or NIL, and I would like to tease out and make clear a couple of key concepts. At its foundation, NIL restores to students who play sports the economic rights of all students. When we talk about categories of athlete compensation to play college sports, 2 primary forms exist: subsidization, or payment for athletes' grant and aid and expenses to attend a particular school, and second, the market for talent, or payment for athletes to play for and remain with a particular sports team. While we have lifted the restriction on athletes earning money from third parties in some ways, we continue to treat our sports teams and therefore our athletes differently from other educational programs and the students who participate in them on our campuses. If a private citizen were to walk into a college's orchestra summer camp and announce that she would be paying for the college scholarships of every musician who wanted to go to that school and giving them generous stipends to boot, she would be celebrated, and these musicians' lives would likely forever be positively impacted. If this same private citizen were then to walk over to the college's football summer camp and announce that she would be providing the same deal, this time for prospective football players and still including those generous stipends, compliance officials would be parachuting in to stop what would be interpreted as an extra benefit or so-called unfair advantage, an NCAA rules infraction. I am joking about the acrobatic administrators, but not about the rest. I'm an educator, and what concerns me are the lessons we have been providing college athletes, especially top-of-pyramid football players, for for decades about their worth. Our policies and actions for too long have undervalued and even have worked to undermine their exceptional talent. And that means the system also has worked to prevent them from fully grasping their sophisticated brilliance. The athletes in my hypothetical scenario would learn a confusing lesson that has long been communicated to college athletes, that some forms of talent are more respectable and noble than others, that their earning money is wrong or bad or seedy or greedy, or that they shouldn't want it because some people say that money would make them care less about school. This likely wouldn't have been a concern or critique with the musicians. We tend to get tripped up when the education program we are looking at is sports-related in U.S. higher education policy. Second, and my next 2 points are not going to have illustrative stories. I'm going to stick to my time. We must begin to tease out and optimize each of the varied sports industries operating under the umbrella of college sports. Some of these varied sports industries have been more than only education programs for a very long time, of course. And they serve different business ends and athlete goals and hold different missions. This process must be clinical and honest. Uniform policies that treat all sports as the same and all athletes as deserving of the same benefits mean that these various sports industries contain design flaws that make the athlete experience worse than what it could be, and it encourages the development of bizarre and even harmful business practices because incentives are improperly aligned. At top of pyramid football schools, uniform policies place the burden of paying for other athletes' world-class academic and athletic experiences onto football athletes. We need to fix this. Third, I am excited that Congress and the NCAA are embracing a much-needed national policy conversation on college sports redesign. This moment is a great opportunity to reimagine and get to work building what American college sports can and should be. We must go big and be bold. Fixing top-of-pyramid football will allow not only for football athletes to get the better deal that they deserve, but also for women's sports and Olympic sports to come out from under the shadow of football and football policy. We must work in a manner that ensures that college sports are actively engaged with the broader American sports ecosystem. The Commission on the State of U.S. Olympics and Paralympics has been hard at work on redesign, and I encourage college sports leaders to join forces with them in this effort. Higher education knows how to innovate and unleash creative solutions to complex problems. Fixing football frees us up to reimagine all of college sports. I see great opportunity to build a new model for sports on college campuses, one that is less dependent on football money, and one that provides more, not less, sports and play participation opportunities in our communities. Thank you for your time. I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thank you so very much. And I'll begin now with the questioning, and I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. First question for President Governor Baker. Thank you for being here again, and thank you for your testimony. You specifically mentioned the importance of recognizing the unique status that student athletes have and affirming that they are not employees of an institution, which would adversely impact our Olympic sports pipeline and the opportunities available for under-resourced schools. Can you elaborate on what's at stake for preserving amateur status for college athletics for smaller schools such as historically black colleges and universities and Division II and Division III schools? If you could elaborate on that, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, thank you very much for the question. One of the things that was in the original Project D1 memo that we sent out was a breakdown of, across all 3 divisions, of how resources are generated by grouping. And if you look at that proposal, or that sort of layout of that, you discover that there are 1,100 schools that provide sports to their students. And of those 1,100 schools, less than 100 of them spend more than $50 million on sports, and the vast majority of them spend less than 25, and a really significant portion of them spend less than 15. And I think this issue gets lost sometimes in the larger conversation about college sports. I think all of us believe, and my D1 proposal proposed, that schools in Division I should have the capacity and the ability to do more to support their student athletes. Schools in Division II and Division III should also have the ability to do that. But if you convert all of college sports into employment, there's simply no doubt, based on math, that you'll lose an enormous number of student athlete opportunities across all three divisions, because the money's just not there. Most schools lose money on sports, even in D1. They offer the programming because it's good for student athletes, because it's good for alumni, because it's good for the schools. And it creates identity, in many cases, in those communities that Congresswoman Dingell talked about, where those schools, in many cases, are the brand and the identity of those communities that they operate in. The big difference between those, call it those top 50, 60, maybe 70 schools, and the other 1,000 schools we're talking about, is the TV piece and the fact that they can attract 100,000 people to attend a sports event like a football game. They are unique and different, which is why we also proposed in our D1 project proposal the idea of creating some sort of subdivision that thinks differently about how they're regulated and how they're managed. But the simple truth is, if you convert all those student athletes who currently benefit from scholarships, who currently benefit from a whole series of other mechanisms that schools make available to them to enhance their educational experience, you're just going to lose an enormous part of what college sports looks like right now.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish I had
brings
more
just
time.
one-
This is
I
really
was just
great.
going to add one more point, which is that Congresswoman Dingell talked about the fact that at the end of the day here, whatever we do needs to work for all of college sports. I agree with that.
Yeah.
I don't think employment works for all of college sports, and I think the math in this particular case is pretty clear.
I appreciate it very much. Commissioner Jackson, I'm appreciative of your partnership and feedback on my draft legislation. You represent a conference, the Valley, that is mainly comprised of smaller schools that don't generate the type of revenue or resources through athletics that others, such as the Power 5 conferences, generate. Can you explain the economics of your programs, such as how revenues from football are used and how, in some cases, tuition dollars are used? Can you highlight the reforms in the Fair College Sports Act needed to protect the current model?
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis. In the Missouri Valley Conference, the average athletic budget is somewhere between $20 and $30 million. Most of our budget is derived from student fees in terms of our student population on campus. And we are in a situation when we go to the table for broadcast agreements, we are not having conversations in the millions and millions of dollars that you hear in some of the A5 conferences. So we're pretty much a money in, money out operation. Our schools do not generate any significant revenue except in one sport. And because of that, the revenue that is earned in that sport is dispersed to help support the other sports that they have on their campuses. We would not be able to exist in a model, at least in the way that we are now, in which student athletes were employees, or we did not have some safeguards and rails around NIL.
Thank you very much, sir. I
I'm sorry?
appreciate it very much. I've got to yield 5 minutes to the ranking member of the subcommittee, Ms. Schakowsky. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I could start just briefly on our personal note, Kiki. My granddaughter, who graduated from Kalamazoo College, was a superstar in softball. I just wanted to say, did you ever hear of her? Mary Hart, she was fantastic. Anyway, and that was a great experience. On a less personal note, Mr. Griffin, I wanted to ask you if you could talk a bit about how NIL has been an important feature in your life. And I know you mentioned it, but if you could talk about how the draft bill would actually restrict your NIL opportunities.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this. NIL has afforded me the ability to truly have a cumulative education while still in college. Every other student, when they get to campus, they're meeting their clique that they're going to end up building their company with. They're interning. They're utilizing their value that they create by being themselves to capitalize on that and practice that. And college athletes being added into that fold puts us on a level playing field. Personally, I've been able to build out a consulting business, a marketing service to Fortune 500 companies, and I've been able to build out my pathways and other endeavors that I do, such as investing or music. I think college athletes always have more to them than their sport, and NIL gives them a chance to practice capitalizing on that value while they're still in college.
And what are the ways that the legislation that's been proposed would actually not help what you want to do?
I think legislation would be overregulation that would discourage some of these companies that have been taking pride in investing in college athletes to not do so anymore, just out of sheer it not being convenient, where they, instead of going to an athlete and having to register for a database or be monitored by a bureaucracy, being able to go directly to other influencers that don't have that same setup around them. This is a very unique set of rules and guidelines and restrictions that other advertisers, other people who would provide these advertisement services would not have to go through.
Thank you. And now for Dr. Jackson. I wanted to ask you a question and appreciate your participation. I wanted to ask you, in its current form, if you believe that this draft bill actually does enough to support college athletes, and if not, what kind of suggestions might you have to do better?
Well, I've heard that NIL, that this is an unsustainable business model, but college sports has been an unsustainable business model, particularly at the top tier, for a very long time. And this moment in 2021 when the restriction on athletes being able to make money from third parties was lifted was in reaction to things that had been happening in response to those unsustainable business practices that cause harm on athletes. I've been thinking a lot about why I oppose elements of this bill, and the first is that it's too narrowly focused. It places unnecessary restrictions on athletes. It contains elements that would be impossible to execute. It closes the door on the redesign possibilities, others that are out there, without exploring them or giving them a chance. It does not address the broader systemic issues that need to be fixed or address, again, why this restriction was lifted in the first place. And it seems to be just perpetuating the monitoring and policing of athletes that so needs to be addressed and halted to begin with.
Well, I appreciate your input, and as we move forward, I want to take into consideration the issues that you've raised. And with that, I yield back my time.
I thank the gentlelady. Now recognize the chairman of the full committee, Ms. Cathy McMorris Rodgers, for her 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Meredith, thank you for being here and for sharing your experience with us. You play at Radford University, a mid-major university in the Big South Conference. Gonzaga University, which is a mid-major university in my district, competes with the best of the best, despite being relatively small-sized. What does the phrase pay for play mean to you?
Thank you so much for your question. I think that pay for play is directly in the name. It's when an institution can directly compensate the student athlete. I think NIL is a wonderful opportunity. It's the fruit of our labors. It's a perk of the student athlete experience. But when you get into employment, into pay for play, and having a lack of a federal standard, I really think that it's a very detrimental for mid-majors like us, like Radford, like Gonzaga. So pay for play, I think, is when institutions are directly compensating for athletic participation.
Thank you. Would you talk just a little bit more about the level of competition at the mid-majors and how you see pay for play impacting your ability to compete with larger universities?
Absolutely, thank you. I think that when you put in pay for play, it just widens the gap even more. Mid-majors, we have excellent competition. We just have excellent competition, excellent players, people that are honestly poached, for higher universities. So having access to that competition having access to that, to the higher playing field, to higher teams. For example, Radford University, we beat Rutgers my sophomore year. So having that access to that higher competition is really important to not only just the entirety of college athletics as an environment, but also just for the integrity of college sports as itself.
Thank you. Thank you. President Baker, thank you for being here. Like Chair Bilirakis, I appreciate your efforts to enhance student-athlete safety and welfare. It's been a long time coming, and I was pleased to see the NCAA adopting registration and disclosure requirements similar to those that are seen in the discussion draft. At the same time, some of your recent proposals, such as allowing schools to directly sign NIL agreements with their student athletes and for the increased payment of enhanced educational benefits, also known as Alston payments, raises some questions. President Baker, how do these changes not incentivize pay for play?
Well, part of the reason we made those proposals was to give the opportunity to make Title IX a much more relevant element in what's currently going on in the broader environment around mostly more highly resourced institutions. And I think one of the great challenges we have is people don't know that much about what's going on with collectives, but it's pretty clear that 90% plus of the money that collectives are spending are going to men. And those collectives, in many cases, have relationships that are either indirect or more direct with the institutions that they're supporting. And if schools had the ability to buy NIL rights without creating an employment relationship, it would be much more accommodating and, frankly, probably more legally feasible to ensure that there was more investment being made in women athletes, which I think is one of the big concerns a lot of us have. We've made tremendous progress over the course of the past 50 years in growing a vibrant and expanding women's sports community in college. And I worry a lot that if we don't do something that makes this much more explicit and puts it in a place where Title IX actually becomes real and important, we could end up seeing significant amounts of money being spent on men. I'm a man, what the heck? But there needs to be balance there. And I think one way to create that balance is to get the schools more involved in it.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I definitely agree with the goal of protecting women's sports. I also want you to address, though, the balance with the smaller schools. So how will this impact smaller schools that may not be able to afford the increased Alston payments?
We're going to take the current constraints that exist within NCAA policy off, and then let schools make decisions about how they think they can go about best supporting their student athletes.
Okay.
And do it within the framework of Title IX.
Okay. Dr. Jackson, do you care to respond?
Yes, and I agree with President Baker. The idea, in my mind, of separation, there's already differences in amenities on campuses. Okay, if you go to the University of Washington, you look at their men's basketball or women's basketball facilities. It's going to be different than some of the institutions that play in my conference. What's important to my conference is access to competition, the ability to feel that their athletes can fairly compete for championships throughout the entire gambit of the NCAA space. And that can happen even though there may be rules that are different for certain institutions, because I'm not sure that those differences in those rules are going to separate in such a fashion that we will not find ways to compete. I think the important thing is that there's clarity about what those rules are, and that those rules do not bleed into inducement, into a circumstance where we don't have transparency, so that student athletes don't have the ability to assess and fully understand what's transpiring.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I have more questions, but I've run out of time. I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Now I recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Castor, for her 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your outstanding testimony. I also want to focus on inducements and pay to play, and then hopefully some Title IX questions if I have time. Now, recruiting has been a part of college sports for a very long time, and Professor Jackson, in your testimony, you identified how inducements have long been the heart of college athletic recruiting. Universities spent about $325 million on recruiting during the 2021-22 school year. Division I institutions spend more on recruitment than on medical care for student athletes. And then in addition, Commissioner Jackson, you're right, a lot of the top athletic programs really have lavish athletic facilities that a lot of our smaller institutions simply can't afford. But now NIL has kind of changed the dynamic on recruitment. It's kind of put more power into the hands of these student athletes. They can decide based on NIL where the best place for their academic, athletic, and professional pursuits will be. But at the same time, these collectives now have really confounded what has been what we hope for college athletics, generally a level playing field, but empowerment of students. And Commissioner Jackson, you said you even used the word fraud in some cases. So I'll start with Professor Jackson. The discussion draft bans NIL agreements that can be construed as an inducement to attend an institution of the athlete's choosing. What effect would such a prohibition have on college athletes' newfound NIL rights? But then how do we balance that to root out fraud and overreaching and some of the misplaced incentives based on NIL?
I agree with you. I mean, inducements are hard to capture, and inducements are everywhere. Everything is inducement. NIL is, to a certain degree, just one of many factors that, prospective athletes are considering when they're choosing where to go to college. And I lost my train of thought.
Well, then let me go to
recruiting. So recruiting spend, if we're talking about gender equity in all of this too, recruiting spending has been in a ratio of 4-to-1, 5-to-1 even at most schools, and that's because of football. This system, if we decide to come up with rules around it and not pursue a different model, seems like a lot of work. Joe Nocera, trying to kind of entrench and codify and regulate this underground market seems like a lot harder than entering into negotiations with groups. And
well, let me ask Ms. Stoll, from the student perspective, how do we balance those considerations, making sure that student athletes are the ones who benefit, that they're making decisions, but addressing, maybe instituting some guardrails on these collectives and the enormous sums of money?
Yeah, for sure. Something that worries me about collectives is, President Baker was talking about, is a lot of these collectives' money is going to men. And for example, at the University of Michigan, we have an official partner of a collective. Now, they don't see any of their funds or anything that's in there, so at Michigan, we can't use NIL to recruit, but a lot of universities are doing it. And what I fear is that these collectives are promising money to these students and then those students get to those universities, and there's no money left. So at that point, that's where the fraud comes into play, and that's where I agree that collectives do need to try to work with universities, because then universities can have access to bank statements and what money they actually have behind it. So these student athletes don't come into universities thinking they're getting all this money, or maybe that money they're sending home to their families because they really need it, and they come in and now they're in debt because they have to take out loans.
Commissioner Jackson, where's the balance?
You know, it's interesting. I think you've got to separate the two terms. Inducement and NIL are not the same things. When I listen to Mr. Griffin, what I hear him espousing is NIL. I hear him talking about taking advantage of his hard work, his entrepreneurial spirit, and trying to figure out ways to make money to make his life easier, or maybe fly his family out, all the different things that he talked about that was beneficial. That is not inducement. That is NIL, and we want everybody to be able to take advantage of that. In our conference and the conference he plays in, that's a huge thing. Inducement changes the paradigm drastically in how all of us would interact with our student athletes. It is very important to understand that as much as we want to see student athlete success, the NCAA is a vehicle that offers those opportunities of success. If you don't have certain rules that allow people to operate under the same umbrella, you could lose that vehicle. And in order to create opportunities for a very small few, I don't want to put the large, giant share of student athletes who have benefited, just like myself, from a student athlete experience, because we aren't or are concerned about setting up rules and regulations that we would probably do in any other circumstance when we were talking about protecting 17 to 24-year-olds.
Thank you. I yield.
Thank you. I appreciate it very much. The gentlelady yields back. Now I'll recognize Dr. Bouchon for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing. This is very important. Everybody in the public's talking about it, of course. All the challenges that we face. I support NIL. I think clearly, in my view, historically, and I think Governor Baker would probably agree, the NCAA has been slightly behind the changes needed to assist student athletes, ultimately leading to the appropriate legal cases, which we know set precedent, and now the Wild West atmosphere that is NIL and the transfer portal. Southwest and West Central Indiana is home to a number of universities with athletic programs ranging from D3 schools like Rose-Hulman to D1 schools like University of Southern Indiana, as well as Indiana State and University of Evansville that are part of the Missouri Valley Conference. I'm very happy to see Commissioner Jeff Jackson before us today to speak about how this issue impacts athletes at mid-sized schools and non-revenue generating programs. That's key. The discussion draft before us today includes many positive provisions that will protect the student-athlete model that enables so many young people to attend a university and compete at the highest levels of their sport. This includes additions stipulating that the student-athletes are not employees of the university. The ranking member mentioned Northwestern University. I was at that hearing, the educational workforce hearing, probably over a decade ago, and out of the result of that, it became very clear, at that time at least, that making student-athletes employees was something that was essentially untenable and not be able to accomplish without severely damaging the future of college athletics. And it relates to the fact that many universities said that they would drop their entire athletic program if this were to happen. Look at all the opportunities lost, and Governor Baker outlined some of that. Do we need our scholarships taxable? What's the tax implications and the other financial implications of being an employee? They're vast. There's labor law there. Well, do we need a national workman's comp program? Each of the states are different. These are just some of the challenges. So we need to work within a framework, in my opinion, that really makes it so student athletes can take advantage of their skills, but we got to be very careful here. Commissioner Jackson, are there any changes or additional information that should be included in the USAIC public database that would help student athletes have a clearer picture of their NIL worth?
You know, I think it's very important with that database that we adhere to a system of anonymity. I'm not looking to find out names. I'm not looking to find out so much specificity that people get uncomfortable with participating in that venue. I think having transparency, I think having more conversations about some of the nuances that are going to be there are paramount. But we're just trying to collect data so that we can have an understanding, and maybe more importantly, our student athletes can have an understanding of what their true value is, and that we now have some clarity in terms of making sure that as institutions and as an overall organization, we can do a better job of protecting them.
Thank you. And also, I know your feedback to the initial draft of the Fair College Sports Act. You mentioned that the addition of a de minimis threshold for NIL deals would help protect athletes and prevent them from having to constantly enter NIL agreements for minor things like a local hamburger ad, TV ad, or something. And just for almost everything, they'd have to enter into some sort of agreement. Do you think the current draft's de minimis threshold will accomplish that? And are there other forms of in-kind compensation exemptions that this committee should be thinking about to protect student athletes?
When I read the draft, that is part of what still needs to be decided, is what that threshold is going to be. But we certainly would want that type of threshold, because in a conference like ours, a lot of the NIL activity, and matter of fact, early on, Mr. Griffin was referring to this, it's gift in kind. It's the opportunity to take advantage of NIL without a lot of a convoluted or cumbersome process. And I do think there's a number that where you have athletes who can do certain things that, again, they're not going through 20 pages or whatever the paperwork is going to be, because it's not a number that rises to a concern in terms of having fair competition across the plains.
Understood.
So I do think you want to have a number like that. I think it's up to that committee and a lot of good minds to decide what that number is.
Governor Baker, I see you shaking your head. You have a comment to make on that issue?
I was just going to say that I agree completely that there should be some de minimis number in there for exactly the reasons that the commissioner discussed.
Okay, great, thank you. Thanks for all of our witnesses. This is an interesting but a very, very important subject for our entire society, honestly. Before I yield back, I would like to enter a letter from the Uniform Law Commission supporting this committee's work on the Fair College Sports Act and the general importance of enacting a uniform set of rules for NIL. I'd like to submit that for the record, Mr.
So
Chairman.
ordered. Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, now we start with the Wolverines back to back. I'm going to recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stingle, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you to all of the witnesses today. You all offer very important perspectives as college sports continues to grow and evolve, and we really need the input of all the perspectives. As I said at the top of this hearing, we're here today to discuss a national NIL framework, and there's a lot of work that remains to be done before any proposal can earn my full support, or probably many on this committee. And as my Republican colleague just said, I know not everybody understands how important sports is to many of our communities, but it is. And it's important really to the future of so many young people. I am concerned that this draft shuts down the debate on athlete employment status and revenue sharing, but the chair has made it clear we're going to keep talking. It also provides an antitrust exemption, which would allow the NCAA and member schools and conferences to come together to artificially limit how athletes can brand themselves and how much money they can receive. We need to make sure we're looking out for the college athletes and not those making off the pain, the sweat, and the tears of the athletes. As we move forward in this process, it's important that we include health, wellness, and safety guarantees. We need to strengthen Title IX, improve the equity for NIL, and ensure collective schools and conferences do a better job of spreading the wealth. In addition, I want to make sure that any governing body that oversees the NIL has representation from the athletes. But now let me turn to some specific questions. Ms. Thole, can you discuss your experiences as a college athlete with NIL on the rise? How have things changed since you started college to where you are today? And I think it would be beneficial for members of this committee to hear you elaborate on what you think NIL's successes have been and challenges are, and what you view the path going forward to be.
For sure. Thank you for the question. So my NIL experience overall has been a great experience. I've enjoyed it. It's been something that has been low maintenance for me, and I think that's been the best part. You do have people that are making content every day, and that's great, and they're going out and building their brand and making money for themselves. And I think that's an awesome opportunity that student athletes get to do that, because we do put so much work into our sport, and it's great for people to recognize us outside of our sport and who we are as people. I do think at the start of NIL, I was very nervous and hesitant to get into it. I didn't know the rules. They were very vague, unclear. There wasn't a ton of help from institutions because they really do have to be hands-off the way that legislation is written. And as NIL has become a little bit more familiar to me, I've been a little bit more confident reaching out to companies and working with people, but I give a lot of thanks to our athletic department because they have been able to set up information sessions and workshops and finding ways for us to work with people so I don't get caught in a situation where I'm taken advantage of. And I have had that situation, and I was able to renegotiate and get myself out of it because of all the resources that we have. But I understand that that's not the case at every university, and that needs to be the case at every university. Every university needs to have education. These student athletes sometimes are going in blind, and they just see money and they just run for it, and they're getting themselves in situations that sometimes you can't come back from. And that leads me to the guardrails. I think there needs to be education put in place for these student athletes so they understand and they realize the importance. I also think there needs to be education around taxes. I mean, some of these student athletes are making so much money, and they don't realize that they have to report all this stuff and who they have to report it to. And I just think it's important that we educate all student athletes on this. But then I pass it off to the coaches. They're struggling right now with recruiting purposes, and trying to get student athletes to come is really hard because you're not supposed to use NIL for inducement to get people to come, but it still happens. And the way legislation is written in certain states, some universities have the opportunity to find a loophole in the writing and talk to these student athletes and promise things, and then those student athletes get there and the money's not there. And that's like my biggest fear is you come to college for your education and your parents send you off to these universities and they're supposed to take care of you and you're supposed to have a coaching staff that you adore and love, and then it's upsetting when you have a collective that isn't loyal and is fraud, and it's disheartening. I don't want to see that happen to student athletes, and it's going to change college athletics into professional sports, and I fear that because Olympic sports, a sport like mine, will get left behind. Women's sports will get left behind, and that's something I fear and I really want us to fight for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to be out of time, so I have more questions for all the witnesses, and I'll submit them for the record. Thank you. That was just an honest answer. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back. Now I'll recognize the gentleman from Michigan, my good friend, Mr. Wahlberg, for his 5 minutes of testimony. And you got it half right. You say go blue. I say go orange and blue.
Everybody's jealous. And because of that, in spite of the fact that University of Michigan never offered me a wrestling scholarship, and they shouldn't have, and no one should have ever paid for my name, image, and likeness, I got to say go blue. Go blue. And it's great to be part of national champions. Take that, Clemson. Okay. And Governor Baker, thank you for being here as well. You state in your testimony that college athletics provide a way for young adults to chase their athletic dreams while simultaneously achieving a college education. I couldn't agree more. You also mention in your testimony about preserving the Olympic pipeline. Now, according to the NCAA annual reporting, since 2015, the number of international student athletes competing in collegiate sports here in the United States has increased approximately 35% to 24,000 students in 2022. The concern that I hear from constituents is that the cost of college education continues to go up, and more American students are struggling to find a path to achieve a college education. I've heard the stories of athletically gifted students working hard and their families making huge sacrifices in hopes that they will have that opportunity that comes through competition in collegiate sports. Sadly, when they go through the recruiting processes, they discover that they're not just competing against other American qualified students, but the world. And so my question, Governor Baker, why do you think more international athletes are being recruited to our collegiate sports? And do you think this disadvantages Americans' competitive edge in the Olympics that you talked about?
So first of all, thank you for the question. And I guess I'd start by saying that one of the reasons why NIL is so important to student athletes generally is the rise of social media and the access people have to information. And I agree completely with what Commissioner Jackson said about what Mr. Griffin's been up to. He is literally the walk and talk and breathing example of what NIL was supposed to be, and in many cases can be and still is. I think part of the answer to your question, Congressman, comes back to my opening remarks when I said that college sports is uniquely American and one of the most powerful human potential development programs anywhere in the world. Other people figure that out. And part of the reason why we've seen a growth in international student athletes is A, the world got smaller because of all the issues associated with access to information and everything else, and B, there is nothing like this anywhere else in the world. And if you're in most other parts of the world, the idea that you could get a world-class education and have a chance to master your athletic craft at the same time, it's just very hard to find that. And I think the...
I get that. I get that. But I also think about the American student who wants a pathway to the Olympics as well. Yep. And you have a situation where, for instance, Michael Phelps, one of his records was broken by a French swimmer who's being trained at Arizona State University. And that has impacts down the line.
Yeah, let me just offer two thoughts on that. One is the 18-year-old population in this country has been declining since 2010 and is expected to continue to decline as far into the future as people calculate this. So the presence of more international student athletes in this country and more international students generally doesn't necessarily mean that they're, quote, competing for slots with existing American students, because we have far fewer American students today than we had 15 years ago, and we're going to have far fewer 15 years from now, just because of the decline in that population. And that means that for many schools, the opportunity to include international students as part and student athletes as part of their student body actually makes it possible for them to continue to pay their bills and operate. The one other thing I would just say is I think the $4 billion that schools provide in scholarships, which we never talk about, is an enormous piece of the benefit that schools bring and that you make tax exempt. And I think in some ways, those resources are there to serve Americans and do. And in some cases...
And I think that's a key concern, to continue to serve Americans.
Yeah.
My time has expired, but we look forward to talking about this more in the future, because I think it impacts in many ways.
Yeah, I would love to talk more, because I actually think at the end of the day, given the drop of our own population, it actually makes it possible for schools to continue to do stuff they might not be able to do without international students. But we should talk about it. I look forward to that.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Lady Representative Kelly for her 5 minutes of testimony, or actually questioning. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Bilirakis and Ranking Member Schakowsky, for holding this morning's hearing. And I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today. It's been very educational for me. I went to college a long time ago, and one thing that really bothered me that the athletes I knew, once they got hurt and they didn't play anymore, so many of them wound up dropping out of college because they couldn't afford to play, or if they felt like they weren't used in the right position and they decided not to play, they could no longer continue college. So it almost felt like a using kind of situation. So I'm glad to see that, we've definitely made progress. But this is the 465-page NCAA Division I manual which college athletes must comply with to maintain their eligibility and retain their athletically related student aid. And here is a 211-page manual of one of the Power 5 conferences, which players must also comply with to maintain their eligibility and retain their athletically related student aid. Yet the very associations and conferences imposing these complex and sometimes cumbersome requirements on college athletes are claiming that players' newfound NIL rights are a source of confusion for athletes. So, Mr. Griffin, have the state NIL laws and your newly found NIL freedoms been a source of confusion for you and your teammates?
I see them not as a source of confusement, but of enlightenment. For the first time, athletes are able to capitalize on the value that they innately have. And a lot of these athletes have histories of being their hometown hero or being the first person in their family, first person in their district to go to college, let alone for free on scholarship and play the sport that they play. And to be able to monetize that and learn through that monetization how to pay taxes, how much you need to pay an accountant, what brands need in order for you to be delivering on their key performance indicators. These are all things that are only learned through experience and things that would be put in jeopardy by overregulation. We've seen that in every young industry, especially ones that are up and coming like NIL, which I think is eventually turning into revenue share as proposed by Governor Baker's last proposal, the free market regulates itself, and the bad actors and bad apples will be weeded out.
Okay. I'm concerned that the discussion draft we're considering today creates an NCAA-like institution with a board that is appointed by members of Congress and disproportionately loaded with representation from athletic associations, conferences, and institutions of higher ed. It appears this institution is empowered to suppress college athletes' rights to enter into agreements, earn compensation, and obtain representation for their use of their NIL. Do you support this new institution, Mr. Griffin, and what effect could it have on college athletes' ability to earn compensation for the use of their NIL?
Yeah, I do not. 21 political appointees, many of whom don't have to have an athletic background, can pose trouble for NIL. And major advertisers and small businesses would never participate in NIL if they had to go through a politically appointed entity like this. The version of true NIL that's being supported by the folks on this dais and the folks on the distinguished member, they are espousing an NIL that is being threatened. And it's because we are trying to weed out bad apples that are really just startups. And most startups fail in the collective space. And over time, the free market will correct those that are doing it wrong, and they will reward those that are doing it the right way and proposing value to the athletes.
I'm also concerned that college athletes failing to make burdensome and unnecessary disclosures mandated by the discussion draft may lose their athletic eligibility. Further, advertisers and other third parties may face criminal penalties and jail time if their NIL deal can be construed as an inducement. Mr. Griffin, do you support such requirements, and what effect could these provisions have on college athletes' ability to earn compensation for the use of their NIL?
No, I think we're seeing by the year-by-year growth of legitimate NIL deals between third parties such as marketers, CMOs, and staffs and agencies of large brands and athletes. We are seeing a transactional business that is beneficial for both parties. As soon as we add oversight in there, it becomes overregulation, and it becomes something that poses more risk than reward, and the sentiments of protecting athletes turn into putting them in jeopardy.
Thank you. Thank you to all the witnesses, and I yield back.
I now represent the proud Clemson Tiger, the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Go Blue. It was a great college football playoff season and bowl season. As a former student athlete myself and a strong college football fanatic, it's good to be here and delve into this issue. I appreciate the work that Chairman Bilirakis and many, many others have put into this issue since NIL
emerged on the scene. Since its inception, we have seen basically 50 state laws created to address NIL in the individual states, and we've got this hodgepodge of laws governing NIL, and I can't imagine being a recruiter or a university or even a student athlete trying to navigate all of this and be in compliance with the law. I'm afraid that what I see happening across the country, potentially, really mirrors a lot of things that Clemson University and University of Florida were dinged for with probation violations by the NCAA back during the Charlie Pell days, where boosters were making promises to athletes in the recruitment process, and just a lot of those things really could happen now. Whether they are actually happening, it's ripe for that. At the end of the day, I have my own opinions about NIL and what it's done to the amateurism of college athletics, and what it potentially long-term with NIL and the transfer portal and how the game's changing all across the spectrum, what it may mean for down-ticket sports with revenue sharing, what it might mean for student athletes as they address tax implications and exploitation and other things that could possibly happen. I think we've got to get it right. It's unfortunate that Congress has to actually act on this, but we need one national standard, I think, versus 50 hodgepodge standards, and I think that is the desire of the committee to address that, to make sure that, you know, recruiters and universities and conferences can get it right. We have a lot to unpack here, so let me just delve right into my first question for Mr. Baker. What jurisdiction does the NCAA have over boosters, collectives, agents, and other third party in the NIL ecosystem?
Well, under the current sort of structure that's in place, limited jurisdiction. If somebody engages in what would be considered to be inducements, to use Commissioner Jackson's term, that is an opportunity for us to investigate a violation, right? But in terms of, like, you know, are there any rules that agents have to comply with? Are there consequences if agents misrepresent to student athletes what's actually available to them? And the answer to that is no. There's virtually no transparency in this space at all, and I'm all in on free markets regulate themselves. Mr. Griffin, the problem is, in America, generally speaking, it has been the job of the federal government to put accountability and transparency and consequences for bad actors in place so that those free markets actually don't take advantage of people and don't misrepresent both price, quality, and everything else. And I do think there's an opportunity for you all to make a really big difference here. And the final thing I'll say is those 50 state laws would not affect what you're up to, Mr. Griffin, because you're doing what we would all describe as real NIL. Many of those state laws are designed to specifically give the schools in their states an advantage over the schools in the other states, and some of them involve, Congressman, the conference that you and your school are part of, with respect to other states passing other laws to disadvantage schools like Clemson.
The free market doesn't work.
I think that's got to get addressed, and I'm glad you're looking at it.
The free market doesn't work in a government-regulated environment like that with the 50 laws and changes. I agree with you. So why we have on the table, based on your answer, this is why we have on the table a suitable medium with this non-governmental entity to eliminate the status quo and yet not become expanded government. I want to ask the student athletes here, do you get tax advice about NIL deals and what tax implications you may have for receiving the revenue from the NIL deals? And I want to hear from your personal testimony about that.
Personally, no, we don't. So
The university doesn't provide you any tax advice or whatever on how to address NIL?
No. Honestly, no. I think it's the same way of a different university can give you, you know, you get 6 more pairs of shoes than I do. I get much less NIL counseling, much less of protection, not protection, I won't say that, but much less counseling on the NIL landscape, which is why I haven't personally.
You know, there is a tax implication on that, receipt of that
100%.
revenue. Mr. Griffin, let me go to you.
I think the only reason why I have experience paying taxes and understanding that landscape is because of NIL. If you're taught how to do taxes and what taxes are, and you have no money to pay taxes, then it's not experiential learning. It's like learning from a textbook. But with NIL, for the first time, I've been able to pay taxes because I've been able to earn money.
Kiki?
No, I don't think most institutions have that opportunity. I mean, at Michigan, we do workshops, but that's nothing near sitting down with me and telling me like my financials and what I need to look out for and how much money is the threshold and what percentage bracket would I be in. And so I think there needs to be education at all universities about taxes.
Thank you. At the end of the day, Mr. Chairman, as we address this draft legislation or whatever Congress do, we have to make sure that we keep the student athlete first and foremost in our mind in all of this. Universities second, conferences third, and the whole NCAA last. So I appreciate your work, and I yield back.
Absolutely, absolutely. Student athlete first, that's what we're doing here. That's why we have them testifying here today. Next, we have Mr. Soto from the great state of Florida. You're recognized, sir, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. College sports are beloved across America. That's something we could all agree on. And these student athletes come from all walks of life, sharing common traits like drive, hard work, discipline, teamwork, excellence. And their actions on and off the field are extraordinary. These athletes help create one of the most popular parts of school pride and of college life. For many smaller communities, they remain the highest level of play, the quintessential home team. And for all these reasons, we see college sports have become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Historically, some student athletes, and we've seen it sometimes in Florida, are stars on the field but impoverished off the field, which has always been a real shame. So states have stepped up, like Florida, around 30 of them, to have name, image, likeness laws, including my home state. And it has I think it's long overdue, but it also has the potential of giving a major advantage to certain wealthier regions or universities with a wealthier alumni network. And it has the potential fundamentally changing the game. That's why Congress needs to step up with at least minimum national standards to ensure a level playing field. And the Supreme Court already has ruled on this, we know. In NCAA v. Alston, they recognize education-related benefits for college athletes. Governor Baker, based upon this precedent, what's the NCAA's opinion of what are students' rights based upon the Alston NCAA opinion?
Well, thank you very much for the question, Congressman. Part of my proposal under the so-called Project D1 was to get rid of the current restrictions that exist within the NCAA bylaws so that schools can offer enhanced educational benefits to their student athletes and also participate in NIL conversations and discussions with their student athletes. I happen to think the schools would be a real asset under the right kind of legal framework to support student athletes in a way they can't now. And as I said when you weren't here before, I do think that would enhance the compliance with Title IX, which I worry about a lot.
Do you think those bylaws are still enforceable after NCAA v. Alston?
I view it as the enhanced educational benefit piece that I'm talking about is significantly different than the sort of rules and the structure in Alston.
Do you think there should be any limits on products or services that students can lend their name, image, and likeness to?
I think the only place where you run into some issues around that would be sports betting, and that's because there's so much money that gets bet on college sports to begin with. I think that one to me is really risky. I worry a lot about sports betting just generally with respect to how it may influence or affect student athletes, and we've actually done a lot of things to start engaging our student athletes in an educational process around sports betting, but we're also at a couple of our championships going to experiment with a technology that tracks vicious, brutal, nasty social media, which oftentimes bettors point in the direction of student athletes and
Thank you, Mr.
officials
Baker.
and coaches.
Mr. Griffin, what do you think the essential elements of a federal law should be? What do you think the rules of the road should be? If you were to explain it to America right now.
Yeah, don't create more rules. I think the courts have already been showcasing the tide. The general public's American opinion has been showcasing the tide, and momentum is in the favor of the athlete and in favor of athlete compensation, as referenced by Governor Baker's proposal. I think if Congress wants to do anything, is conduct more research on what the overall NIL landscape truly is. I think oftentimes a lot of the thought leadership in this room has been contained in an echo chamber between Congress, the NCAA, and the media that's reporting on all of the horror stories of collectives. When Open Doors already told us that 80% of NIL transactions are between athletes and brands that have nothing to do with collectives. In addition, there are a lot of for-profit operations in the collective side that are generating money for the athletes and are sustainable models that will continue to add value in the future. It's the models where there's collectives that are just funneling or promising the funneling of donor dollars to athletes that is posing issues. But
Thank you,
any type
Mr. Griffin, because my time's limited. Well, you have a seat at the table today, along with your fellow student athletes, so we're knocking down the walls of that echo chamber, and thanks for being here.
Thank the gentleman. We have, next we have Dr. Dunn from North Florida, good friend of mine, and I know he's very interested in this issue. So I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for questioning.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important hearing. I think we all realize that. And thank, by the way, the panel, illustrious panel, for sharing your time and effort with us and all the work that you put in on this. I think it's clear that the current fragmented NIL landscape is wholly inadequate to protect student athletes or institutions from bad actors seeking to exploit the system. And the uncertainty that's been caused by this patchwork of state laws has turned what was a good idea into one that is an idea of instability and liabilities. Playing college sports is important. It provides an opportunity for our student athletes. I think the college athletics absolutely fosters the development of life skills that extend far beyond the playing field. I think Brian Kilmeade said that in his book, The Games Do Count. But a federal framework is needed now more than ever to protect the integrity of the sports and ensure that the opportunities that have been afforded to our college athletes continue to be afforded. One of the biggest challenges facing this is an effort to make the student athletes employees of the respective schools. I think that's unequivocally not the right direction for college athletics to go. I applaud Chairman Bilirakis for standing strong on that. So I think it's important to be that allow the athletes to be considered employees of the school would seriously hurt the student-athlete experience. This move would have a particular impact on the historically black colleges, such as Florida A&M in my district. And I'd like to enter a letter into the record, Mr. Chair, from the 4 historically black athletic conferences outlining their concerns and objections to a proposal that would classify student-athletes as employees of the university.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. HBCUs often do not have the same depth of resources as some of the larger schools and rely on institutional support to fund those programs. And this further strains their resources, and that'll have a negative effect on the ability of the schools to provide robust athletic experience across all the sports. Ms. Dahl, thank you for being here. And could you speak to your early NIL deals and how they compare to your later NIL deals as your career progressed?
Thank you for the question. My early NIL deals were very low maintenance. Contracts weren't multiple pages. I understood most of the language on all the contracts. Very easy to work through. The company was a great contact, and I didn't feel it put too much stress on my outside things like softball and school. As I've progressed in the NIL game, I do take a little bit more effort in what I do. For example, one of my deals is with the United Dairy Industry of Michigan, and I work closely with them, and we've done like 4-hour photo shoots and done different segments with dairy farmers around the state of Michigan, and it's come a little bit more immersive. And I feel when you work with a great company, it's a lot easier. But
Let me ask you, if I can ask you, were you ever concerned with the lack of certainty in the regulations, the NIL regulations, that might cause you eligibility problems?
yes, I actually was working with a company. Well, I didn't work with them, but I had reached out because it was a product I had been using, and they were doing NIL deals, and I really wanted to work with them. But in their legislation, the contract that they sent me, it had some things that really concerned me. And if I would have signed that contract, I would have lost eligibility.
Very good. So you agree that it's important that we stabilize these regulations and create certainty for athletes so they can pursue these NIL opportunities if they can?
Yes, I do think regulation needs to be put in place because at this point, too, if regulation isn't put in place, a lot of Olympic sports and women athletes the gap's going to widen and we're going to be left behind.
Well, so I want to say I applaud the work that's been done by the subcommittee, but also by the NCAA Committee on NIL. I know you've put a lot of effort into this over the years. I look forward to continuing to work with you and make sure that we make progress on this and try to get this as right as we possibly can, coming right out of the gates. This is important work. I don't have to tell this panel that college athletics is a beloved institution throughout America and for all of us. And it doesn't matter whether it's a large school or small school. You all deserve our protection and our attention. So thank you very much for your time and effort. I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate it very much. And now, 5 minutes, I'll recognize Representative Trahan for her 5 minutes of questioning. I appreciate you being so patient.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I fear, given some of the rhetoric that we've heard at this hearing and others like it, that Congress as a whole has lost its credibility on this issue. Mr. Griffin, you recently helped lead a survey of college athletes, which, among other things, asked what stakeholders they trust. What group of people do athletes trust the least?
Congress.
That should concern each one of us here today, that the very people this committee is seeking to quote unquote protect don't actually trust that we have their best interest at heart. And I don't think that as drafted, the bill that we're focusing on today will do much to change that. Mr. Griffin, the Fair College Sports Act would create a new governing body completely controlled by political appointees, none of whom are required to be current athletes like you, Ms. Thal, or Ms. Page, making rules about athletes' day-to-day lives and NIL rights. And it would do so while minimizing options for athletes to appeal a punishment and providing legal immunity to the punishers. Does that governance structure concern you?
Absolutely does.
Thank you. I'm also concerned with provisions in the bill that would allow schools to regulate and potentially bar athletes from engaging in NIL activities on campus. Mr. Griffin, given how much of your daily schedule is already controlled by your school and your coaches, do you think it would be detrimental if you were forced to leave campus to, say, post about a brand or product on social media during your free time?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So I have some serious reservations about advancing a bill that places those kinds of restrictions on athletes' NIL rights. And I'm equally worried about what the Fair College Sports Act fails to address. There are currently over 25,000 international athletes competing in college athletics, but under the current law, they are unable to exercise their NIL rights in the United States. Ms. Page, during your sophomore year at Radford, you played alongside a teammate, a setter from Germany. Do you think it's important that if Congress advances NIL legislation, it closes the loophole that deprives international athletes of the same NIL rights that you have?
Thank you for your question. I think it's very important for the international student athletes to have the same access to NIL that we do. They're doing the same schedule that we are. They have the same rights that we do. So I think it's very important for them to have the opportunity as well.
Well, thank you, Ms. Page. I worry that the majority is advancing a bill that fails to address some of the most basic issues facing athletes, and none are more obvious than international athletes being denied the same NIL rights as their teammates. Ms. Thal, in your testimony, you raised concerns about gender equity with regard to collectives. While that's an issue that also goes unaddressed in this legislation before us today, I couldn't agree with you more. That's why Senator Chris Murphy and I sought to address this in our College Athlete Economic Freedom Act, requiring that collectives offer equal opportunity to all athletes at a university, whether it's the opportunity for a deal directly with the collective, deal facilitation with a local business or brand, or even education surrounding NIL, taxes, or other financial matters. Ms. Thal, can you elaborate on why you think it's important that if Congress acts, we work to ensure that schools and collectives support all athletes and are held to a high standard of gender equity?
Thank you for the question. Women's sports, like I said, has come so far, and there's still so much farther we need to go. And not even just from male-female perspective, I also think there's a gap between revenue-generating sports and Olympic sports. And I believe that if we don't put any legislation in there, we will see a lot of lost opportunities from many sports. You won't see kids play sports anymore because there'll only be a select few that are allowed to play in college. And growing up, my favorite thing was to watch players in college or professional softball players. And now I'm in that role, and I'm inspiring young girls. And I fear that that won't be the future if this legislation is put in place.
Thank you. Look, Title IX is the reason tens of thousands of women have had the opportunity to continue their athletic careers in college, get an education, and succeed after school. It's the reason I'm sitting here today. So, Dr. Jackson, with the time I have left, do you think it's fair that under Title IX today, schools are allowed to double or triple count women athletes, count roster numbers at tryouts instead of once the season starts, and even count male practice players as women athletes? And do you agree we should be discussing those loopholes?
We're talking about participation opportunities here in an education program, so absolutely.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Gentlelady yields back. And now I'll recognize Ms. Lesko from the great state of Arizona. We're going to miss you dearly. I wish you would reconsider because you're a great member of this committee. But I'll recognize you for 5 anyhow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and you still have to put up with me for 11 more months, so I'm here till the end of my term. Thank you to all of you for coming here and testifying today and spending hours with us. My first question is for Mr. Baker. Mr. Baker, Riley Gaines, a former 12-time NCAA All-American swimmer, recently hand-delivered a petition with over 70,000 signatures, and this letter that I'm holding up to the NCAA. And I'm going to briefly read a couple things that are in this letter. It was dated January 11th, 2024, to President Charlie Baker and the NCAA Board of Governors. We write on behalf of a coalition of women's organizations to demand that the NCAA meet with female athletes adversely affected by its discriminatory practice of allowing male athletes on women teams. Without single-sex competition, there can be no equal athletic opportunity. The NCAA knows this, yet it continues to propagate a policy that allows male athletes on women teams. We renew our demands to the governing body to repeal all policies and rules that allow male athletes to take roster spots on women's teams and or compete in women's events, and establish and enforce the right of female athletes to participate in sports based on sex, and require its member institutions to provide single-sex locker rooms for female athletes. The NCAA has not acted on any of these demands, and instead, women's rights have been further eroded. My question to you, sir, will you commit to meeting with the women athletes as requested in this letter?
Sure.
My next question is, will the NCAA make the changes requested in this letter?
I mean, just for your own information, every single NCAA championship, the host community and the host institution and the host organization under our current rules is required to provide safe and secure accommodations to all athletes. And if athletes are looking for specific solutions to deal with concerns that they have, they're going to get them. And we should never be in a position where we're putting somebody in a position where they feel they're not safe, period. I can't speak to what happened before I got here, but those are the rules as they stand right now.
Well, that's good to hear. Now, Ms. Riley Gaines in recent media articles had said that she had sent you a letter back in January of 2023, so a year ago, and that she had not received a response. And so she was disappointed that she, even though you said those things, that she hadn't gotten a response and nothing's really changed.
Well, my first year, my primary objective was to do something nobody had ever done before in my job, which was to meet with all 97 conferences, which was obviously a big lift, and to get a sense from them about what the key issues and opportunities associated with college sports were. And I've spent dozens of hours with current student athletes. And as I said in my opening answer to your first question, if folks want to have an open conversation about issues associated with college sports and women's sports generally, we'll figure out how to make that happen.
Well, good. I hope it happens soon. I'll call him right when I'm done with this hearing and let him know you're willing to meet with him.
Okay.
Next question is for Commissioner Jackson. In your testimony, you advocate strongly for increased transparency into NIL. I've heard from some of my colleagues across the aisle that such transparency would be used by bad actors to set athlete compensation. However, Section 102 of the discussion draft would include requirements that the USIAC may not fix student-athlete compensation. How would those claims conflict with the duties on the USIAC, and why do you believe sunlight is the best disinfectant?
Well, again, we're not trying to get specific information. The student athletes who would be participating in this, as I understand the draft, would be under anonymity. So we're just trying to get a general idea of where things are in regards to a market value. Nothing more, nothing less. I don't really see this as being something that is overly invasive. On our campuses, we get information all the time from student athletes, whether it's their academic information. It's pretty commonplace on the college campus. So again, just trying to do a better job of making sure that we can keep them safe, making sure that we understand what's transpiring, and allowing them to be, to have good decision-making process and how they decide things.
Thank you. And with 12 seconds, I think I'm over my time. I yield back.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And now we'll recognize Mr. Fulcher for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the panel for being here and for just helping us get educated as we're trying to do the right thing on this. Mr. Jackson, we've been talking about some federal standards, and in particular in the area of requiring agents to register. How would that impact FCS schools, for example, and for organizations that you represent?
I think the most important thing is it keeps our student athletes safe. They understand that when they're signing a contract, there are certain standards, certain parameters that those contracts hold. Agents being true agents, being people who actually are true representatives and are following legal standards in their representation of those student athletes is paramount. So to me, having certification, having an opportunity to know who you're dealing with, having contracts on file so that you can understand how those contracts are impacting student athletes is just one of the levers that we need to pull on to make sure that we're keeping our student athletes safe.
Thank you for that. Mr. Baker, you've touched on this, but I want to just try to get some clarification if I can. Some of the fraudulent and deceptive trends.
Say again, I'm sorry?
Some of the fraudulent and deceptive type trends that you see. So you met with 97 conferences. That's a lot. Can you generalize in a few seconds the things you're concerned about the most?
The biggest thing I'm concerned about is misrepresentation to student athletes about what's possible, driven in many cases by third parties that are collecting names and positions, skill positions, to encourage student athletes to leave their existing scholarship at their existing school, go into the transfer portal, and then it turns out that several of them, many of them, thousands of them, discover, having gone into the portal and given up the scholarship that they had at their previous institution, there actually isn't an opportunity for them available somewhere else. And until there's some transparency and some consequence associated with this, I think we're going to continue to have this problem. The second thing I would really like to see, and we do this in all financial transactions everywhere in this country, is some kind of uniform standard contract, so that a student athlete knows that if, and an agent knows, that if somebody's going to sign a contract, they know what to expect in it from a, terminology, terms, conditions, and all the rest. And if an agent or someone who wants to purchase somebody's time or brand wants to vary from that uniform contract, they have to ask permission. And the other thing I really want on that thing is I want it to say that the agent works for the customer. In every other financial sector in our country, when you decide you're going to be an agent or a broker or play a role like that, you sign something that says on that deal that you are going to work for the customer. We have people in this space right now who don't work for the customer, and I think that's a problem.
Got it. Thank you for that. Ms. Page, from an athlete standpoint, same question. Fraudulent, deceitful trends that you see.
I would like to echo everything President Baker just said. It is incredibly, so not only are athletes entering the portal and not finding a home at another institution and then finding out that their NIL deal isn't possible anymore, they're also going to that institution and finding out that their educational credits don't even transfer. So there's a lot of times when an athlete, I've seen this myself with one of my friends, went to another university on a recruiting inducement, and then she was now a sophomore again instead of being a senior. So that's a trend I commonly see in this space of not having that educational focus and detouring from that for a recruiting inducement.
Thank you for that. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from several student athletes who are part of the Big Sky Conference. These are not students who come from high-profile, revenue-generating sports programs, but from programs that offer scholarships and other opportunities for student athletes, including one from my home state of Idaho, Thomas Patterson University of Idaho. And they're appreciating in this letter legislative efforts being discussed today and to recognize and protect student athletes, not to see them as employees, but to put them in charge and make them responsible for their opportunities. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit that for the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Yield back.
Okay, moving along here, now we'll recognize Mr. Allen for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and this is a very important hearing, and thank you, all of you, for your expertise. You know, I'm on the Education and Workforce Committee, so we have some governance on this. However, we're trying to authorize higher education as we speak, and we still haven't gotten it authorized, so you can understand how difficult it is to get these things through Congress. I think our founders kind of designed it that way. This is, you know, what's important, I think, is to get football, college football at least, back to some normalcy. And that means preserving amateur status. And for example, the USGA, which is golf's governing body when it comes to amateur versus professional athlete, you know, if you are going to maintain your amateur status, you can only make up to a certain amount of money. And I don't know the details on that, and it would be interesting to see what, because I'm sure college players are getting NIL. Golfers are getting NIL money, and I don't know how they're maintaining their amateur status, but we need to find out how that is working. I want Congress to pass a law that will give the appropriate authorities needed to oversee the NIL marketplace. You have to have guardrails, and once it's passed, I don't want us to have to keep legislating on this. I want the ball back in your court where it needs to be. Mr. Thal, I also serve on the committee, as I said, on the Committee of Education and Workforce, and we deal directly with labor issues. And I can assure you, dealing with the National Labor Relations Board can be difficult. I'm not going to ask you to get into what NLRB is doing with the NCAA, but what does strike me as confusing is if you accept the premise that student athletes should be employees, and there's clearly an agenda behind that to give them to unionize them, then how would that work in college athletics?
Is that a question for me?
Yes.
I'm against the unionization of student athletes for the pure fact that I think at universities what would happen is our revenue generating sports would make a union for themselves and take their money with them, and then therefore, like Congresswoman Dingell said, University of Michigan has 29 sports teams. You would lose 75% of them because they would have zero funding to work.
And you know that each state has different right-to-work laws. I mean, like Georgia has a right-to-work law, which
means that you can play college football and you do not have to be a member of the union. It's your choice. In some states, it's not like that, so it gets very complicated. In fact, the reason we're here today is because states are legislating this. All of the lawsuits have been brought by the antitrust, which is why Congress is involved, because it's a federal agency. So you can see why we have all this overlap. So you can kind of see where I'm going with this. How do you see unionization disrupting the coexistence of women's and men's sports and their status as revenue generating?
I think that the revenue generating will just become richer, and like I said, I think you'll lose a lot of opportunities with Olympic sports and women's sports, and then how do universities abide by Title IX at that point?
Thank you. Mr. Griffin, I trust that you and your fellow players are supportive of the synergy that exists for supporting all programs on campus. I looked at your information. You're quite an entrepreneur already, and I congratulate you on that because that's the world I come from. But regardless of how they appear on a balance sheet, is that correct?
I think college football athletes take pride in doing something that helps allow other programs within their alma mater compete in their sports. And then on the topic of employee status, that's not really up to athletes. Like you said, that's up to the National Labor Relations Board. But I do think it's important to note that currently, based off of the amount of time, effort, and hours that we do on a daily basis, on a weekly basis,
no
on an
question.
annual basis, that we operate as employees currently.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm out of time, and thank you again so much for being here, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. The gentleman yields back. And now we will recognize, yes, okay, Mr. Pence. Mr. Pence, another person we're going to miss dearly, but you still got a year to go, and I know you'll make the best of it. So I'll recognize you for 5 minutes for questioning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and back at you. Chairman Bilirakis, Ranking Member Schakowsky, thanks for holding this hearing, and thank you all the witnesses for being here. College athletics are deeply rooted in the cultural fabric of our communities. The Hoosier State's no different. I actually represent Indianapolis, and I have, and of course the NCAA headquarters is in there, and a lot of the employees are in my district. Institutions of all sizes, from Purdue and Ball State to Indiana University and Bloomington, have long, rich histories that are part of the fabric of rural Indiana. Student athletes at these institutions compete in and cross state lines to proudly represent the Hoosier State. NIL provides opportunities for big-name schools and national brands, as well as smaller community endorsements to assist students that are not in the national limelight. Take Indiana University, for example. A collective, Hoosiers for Good, partners with athletes and facilitates a minimum of 1-year commitment for an athlete to partner with a charity of their choice. Many of these students continue to give back through scholarships to first-generation college students and more. Any consideration for Congress on a national standard for NIL compensation should seek to preserve the rich tradition of competition that college sports have afforded to communities across the country, and particularly in my state, Indiana. President Baker and Commissioner Jackson, I'm going to, at the end of my comment here, the question is for each of you. President Baker, you stated the NCAA is making changes to improve the outcomes for student athletes across all 3 divisions and is acting to clarify and improve the NIL environment, but there are significant issues outside of your control. Many sports experts have referred to the current NIL environment as Wild West, why we're here today. Given the NCAA's December announcement to create a new subdivision for Division I schools, who's to say it will not lead to powerful conferences like the SEC from leaving and creating, of course, a super conference that everybody's talking about? Commissioner Jackson, in your testimony, you stated you're unsure the establishment of an independent entity is necessary to enforce the rules outlined in the draft legislation. Very self-serving, very concerned about the viability of the NCAA. How will the NCAA remain viable and a relevant entity if professionalism comes into college sports, the way we're talking about or contemplating. First you, Mr.
So first of all, Congressman, thank you for the question. And I guess I'd just say the following. The first is we've done a lot of work over the past year to enhance the support that we provide to student athletes. Starting in August of this coming year, beginning of the school year, scholarships are guaranteed whether a student athlete chooses to play or not. And these are all Division I issues, which is where most of what you're talking about, I think, is relevant. Scholarships are guaranteed whether they play or not. They have 10 years of access to that scholarship to complete their degree. They have access to health and well-being services. These are requirements, and all three divisions will have access, student athletes in all three divisions will have access to a 2-year injury insurance protection program.
So if I may, yeah, and you kind of outlined some of those. Those are great things, great protections for the students. And I've met with a number of students in the universities in my area. But what's going to happen to the NCAA if we do have these super conferences? That's really my question.
Well, you can certainly operate a subdivision or a super conference within the framework of the NCAA generally. And I think the most important...
Under the NCAA or outside?
Inside, sure.
Okay.
I think the most important thing that needs to be preserved is the opportunity for conferences like the one that's represented by Mr. Jackson and conferences that are represented by Ms. Page and some of the other folks here to be able to continue to participate in national championships. And I would argue everybody should have access to those national championships because for all intents and purposes, the big thing I hear from student athletes when I talk to them about what are they most pleased with and excited about.
If I may, if Commissioner Jackson, you could give a quick answer. I'm running out of time.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I agree with everything that President Baker just stated. The most important thing for our conference is championship access. Some of the things in regards to amenities already exist, so there is already some variance between the institutions conference-wise and in your state, from Indiana to Indiana State. But we want that championship access, and we want rules and policy to allow us to feel that we can legitimately compete in that championship arena.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the good lady from Dolly Parton country and Spurrier country from the great state of Tennessee. You're recognized for 5 minutes for your questioning. Ms. Harshberger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you all for being here today, too. This is really, really an important issue that we have to address, but I do wish, however, that we could have had a witness here representing the collectives because we need to look at opposing viewpoints and get their feedback as well because we're putting guardrails on them and we need to hear from them. So without objection, I'd like to submit the testimony of the Collectives Association for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, so ordered.
Okay. President Baker, I am aware that the NCAA issued its interim NIL rule in July 2021, and it's my understanding that in the 2.5 years since the NCAA issued and has issued numerous subsequent guidance documents about how schools and student athletes can interact with collectives. Do you acknowledge that the frequency in changing the guidance has been inconsistent and unclear, and that the ambiguity has left schools, student athletes, and collectives with uncertainty about how to follow the rules? That's a yes or no.
That is a yes.
Yes.
Which is why we're doing what we're doing now to create bylaws.
So
Yes.
how do you plan to bring clarity to those stakeholders, sir?
Well, the first piece we started with, because we thought it was the most important part, was, and thank you for the question, was around the consumer protection piece.
Yeah.
Creating a uniform standard contract, giving student athletes some de-identified database so they'd be able to figure out, quote unquote, what market looks like, and giving them generally better access to information so that they can make the best decision for themselves and for their families. The other thing I would just say is we're going to also pursue the institutional involvement part. We would like schools to be able to provide us more guidance and more advice to their student athletes, because we heard from a lot of student athletes that nobody else was giving them a lot of that information, and create a registry. I wouldn't call it a registry. It's more of an opportunity for student athletes to recommend agents who they believe are working in the best interest of student athletes so that other student athletes would know that and could choose to pursue those folks. But in the end, just given how contentious and litigious this world has become, having the backstop of a federal commitment to give us, at least in some areas, the ability for rules that get written to support student athletes to actually be sustained without spending all our time in court fighting those rules.
Really? You come to the federal government for us to solve the problem. That's not a place you want to come.
I'm just looking for your help so that when someone comes after me and goes to
I got
court.
you, pal. I got you. It's those guidance documents. Anyway, Commissioner Jackson, I'm glad that the focus of this legislation is on preventing tampering in recruiting, and the effect of the combined transfer portal and the NIL has been, I don't want to call it a disaster, but it's been problematic for college football, particularly during the bowl season. And I'm concerned with the ways that players have been transferring repeatedly with the hope that the collectives affiliated with the new school will provide additional money. And just like President Baker stated earlier, there are athletes giving up their scholarships, entering the transfer portal, seeking NIL payments, and then they end up with nothing. So my question is, do you have suggestions on ways we can tailor this legislation to better address the incentives from the transfer portal?
Well, I think the legislation is a great start.
Okay.
I think having transparency, having the ability to limit bad actors, because a lot of what you're talking about, the impetus for that are people looking at student athletes and seeing an opportunity to take advantage and exploit them financially. And I think if we can minimize the ability of bad actors to infiltrate and create possible poor decisions by our student athletes, that would help tremendously.
Okay. Let me see. President Baker, I'm concerned that some pieces of the system will just end up penalizing people who get caught, while others are going to continue to win by skirting the rules. And my question is, do you have any suggestions on ways to strengthen the due process protections of the USIEC?
I think I would actually like to, and I said this when I spoke with the chairman recently, I would love to have a conversation with the committee about that issue, because I think there are things that could be done to ensure that, especially around some of the issues associated with inducement and misrepresentation, which are the things I worry about the most, there are definitely some things we could do together on that.
Okay. Well, my time is up, so I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Gentlelady yields back. Now I recognize my fellow Florida Gator, Ms. Kamick, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Lots of SEC love up here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this great hearing today. Very important and timely topic. Thank you to all our witnesses for appearing before us, and sorry about the weather. Now, before I jump into questions, I'd like to associate myself with remarks from my colleague from Arizona, Representative Lesko, regarding Title IX, protection of women in women's sports, and really implore you, President Baker, to protect our women athletes, to meet with our women athletes, to address the concerns that they have. I really believe that if the NCAA wants to maintain credibility when it says it wants to protect Title IX, that this is a very important step. And I know you inherited some pretty disastrous decisions, but this is a moment where we have to address this issue and make sure that men are not competing in women's sports. There are 200,000 plus women athletes who are counting on us and you, and I hope we can have your commitment. So I know in your testimony with the Senate that you had been eager to partner with Congress to bolster and protect Title IX protections as it related to NIL. Can you make that same commitment to protect Title IX and women's sports broadly? Specifically, can you commit today to reversing the NCAA's policy adopted under your predecessor that allows biological men to compete in women's sports?
Well, first of all, let me just say I understand the reason this issue is such a complicated one for people and such a challenging one. Almost every governing body that I'm aware of in sports believes there should be a men and a women version, but in very individualized circumstances, there has to be some standard for transgender athletes if they can meet certain conditions
Baker,
to qualify.
Respectfully, and because I do want to get to a very specific question with regard to NIL,
and the transfer portal. It is not difficult. It is not complicated. It's DNA. There are physiological differences, and let's follow the science. That should be the position. Men are men, women are women, and that is that. So we'll move on, because I know this is where we need to get to the heart of the issue. But talking with several of our coaches, there are serious concerns about how to manage a roster with the transfer portal in place. People are pulling their hair out. How can we address these concerns? And do you believe there should be restrictions or consequences for entering the transfer portal multiple times?
I guess what I would say is the Wild West that we talked about before of NIL creates a significant piece of this. And again, I keep coming back to this is not what Mr. Griffin is talking about. Correct. This is the issue associated with inducement and in many cases misrepresentation. And part of the reason why I would like to see something like what we proposed, which makes it possible for student athletes to receive additional enhanced educational support from their school, as well as giving their schools the ability to engage with them directly around NIL. I do believe that could help with regard to this without putting the burden on student athletes. This one would actually put it on the schools to do more for student athletes, to support them, and to sustain their relationship with them. But again, in the absence of federal legislation that sort of validates this kind of an approach and makes it possible to do it without turning them into employees, which for your state and many others is a problem, we're just going to end up right back in federal court, which is where we are now on the whole issue of
I know there's an
transfer policy.
antitrust situation that we're really kind of dancing around, and I understand that. And Mr. Griffin, I heard you loud and clear, and I want you to be wildly successful. I want all of our folks to make oodles of money and be wildly successful. It is the inducements that are problematic, that are causing chaos within college sports. And so I do want to set the record straight. One of my colleagues mentioned that the majority, our side of the aisle, is not concerned with the implications of our foreign athletes. That is actually something that was mentioned in our previous hearing on this issue. And I would love for us to find a way to open up NIL opportunities for our foreign athletes. I think that it is a fairness issue. So I just wanted to make sure that we set the record straight on that. And Mr. Jackson, I really appreciate your commentary here today and the time that I have remaining. Can you talk about how your conference has had to alter your recruiting efforts to address some of these issues around inducements and NIL deals?
I was speaking with a coach the other day, and he referred to name, image, and likeness as name, image, and lies. Because one of the things that we have to continually grapple with as a conference is when we have student athletes perform at a certain level, they are constantly besieged by other institutions, bad actors, sometimes with false promises, sometimes with outright inducement in terms of financial compensation to leave that institution to attend another. And as I've said earlier, that is not NIL. That is something very much different. And again, we're very appreciative of the fact that this committee is taking this up because, as President Baker has said, there are certainly things that the NCAA is efforting to do, but we do need your help to have the complete model so that we can keep our student athletes safe and have a fair playing landscape for all of our institutions.
Absolutely. I appreciate all of the commentary. Thank you again for all being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield. Gentlelady yields back. Now we'll recognize Mr. Vesey from the great state of Texas for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Baker, I want to ask you, because I do think that there needs to be some guardrails that are better established and put up, and I appreciate that. I think that the legislation that we're considering today probably has too many in there, and I cite some of the concerns that Mr. Griffin spoke about earlier about there being too much regulation and too much restraint put on the athletes. But I was just wanting to sort of pick your brain about, why we're focusing on this first. And I wanted to ask you, because one of the things that concerns me about college sports right now is that we literally are going to have kids next season that are going to be getting on planes in Northern California, and they are literally going to be flying from Northern California all the way over to the East Coast. And as student athletes, they're going to be spending most of their time on planes.
They're not going to be a part of the college social experiment. They are probably going to have to do most of their work on Zoom. This is a committee that had to do a lot of work on Zoom, and we actually got tired of it. We're happy to come back here. These kids are going to have their whole career for 4 or 5 years, if they redshirt, spent on planes. How is that good for college athletes, and why are we not here regulating that first?
Well, first of all, I think the issue you're raising is a legitimate one, and we've had many conversations with school leadership and with coaches and others and commissioners about how to think differently about organizing the schedules to address some of those issues. And I would describe it as still a work in progress, but I do believe there are ways to think. I'll give you sort of a generic example, right? There are many sports where you could have 3 teams or 4 teams engage in what I would call a round robin over a 2 or 3 day period over a weekend and basically play a large number of games that normally you would have played one at a time. We do that in a number of sports right now. We do it in golf, we do it in tennis, we do it in some others. But there are other sports where you could do that as well, and that would certainly reduce some of the travel issues. And I said at the time that this issue first came up that I thought dealing with and figuring out the scheduling challenge was going to be sort of job number 1 for everybody.
Yeah, and let me also ask you this, because, you know, one of the things also worrisome, and I literally can remember when I was still in the state legislature, and I would drive from Austin all the way back to Fort Worth. And whenever you would drive through Waco, you would see pictures of Robert Griffith and Brittany Griner all over Waco in businesses, billboards.
Yep.
That was obviously a win, not just for Baylor, but for the city, and people were monetizing that. And there were no regulations put on how they were monetizing their name, their image, or their likeness. And I guess back to what the points that Mr. Griffith was making earlier, if you tie the student athletes' hands to the point to where they also can't participate for themselves at that level, how is that helping them? And that's my concern with the legislation that we're considering today, is that there are too many restraints that are put on for them to really be able to take advantage of their name, image, and likeness.
Well, I can just tell you that I think name, image, and likeness is a great thing for young people generally and student athletes in particular, and I support it wholeheartedly. And as I said before, I think a big piece of what Mr. Griffin's been up to is exactly what was intended by the original court decision. I do think if we're going to be in this space where organizations are going to make commitments either through third parties or directly that don't pan out to be real because there isn't a regulatory framework in place from either us or from Congress, we need to do something about it. And the transfer reported data and the number of kids who end up not landing somewhere is in the thousands.
Let me ask you this before my time expires.
They are pulled into this thing.
Let me ask you this before my time expires, too, and I want to go back to the regional rivalries. For any other sport other than football, how is what's happening in college sports right now good? Like, how are these cross-country, these literally coast-to-coast conference matchups going to be good economically or for the students, unless it's football related? Because I don't understand that, and that's my concern, is that we're taking these 2 sports that, quite frankly, that black males have done very well in, football and basketball, and those are the 2 that really are drawing the most concern about what's happening in NIL, and we're trying to be very quick to regulate those. But there are just many other issues that I think need to really be addressed that no one is talking about. But all of a sudden, when they start making a little bit of money, then all of a sudden we need to just swoop in and regulate this, and and that's my biggest concern. I think that your concerns are legitimate, but we really do need to see if we can get the conversation centered back towards the athlete more. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Iowa, Ms. Miller-Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I'm not going to claim to be an athlete. And in one of the witnesses' testimonies, and thank you all for appearing, you mentioned talk to athletes. So I want to say that I've met with more athletes about this issue,
both current at the University of Iowa, both sexes. I've met with previous athletes when they come down to the field. When we do the wave at the University of Iowa game, I've met with a coach. And I'd also say thank you, Mr. Jackson, for bringing your perspective. We have several, University of Northern Iowa and Drake University, although not in my district, but certainly within your conference. And I would also appreciate the comments made by my colleague, Representative Vesey, just now. I too have concern over the conferences expanding and adding new schools, primarily because we're in the Big Ten. So Michigan has it partly right. They're blue and gold, and so go gold, go Hawkeyes. But needless to say, when you're traveling those distances and you're a college athlete, one of the reasons you're there is to get an education. And so for football, it's not a big deal to travel for one game on a weekend. But if you're in basketball or softball or an Olympic sport, that's at a college, that is a big deal if you miss class the next day when you're on a typical airline, not a charter, and I can tell you for the past 2 weeks, airline travel has been chaotic. So that is the concern for student athletes, is the travel burdens, and then their educational performance. And I think as we look at this, and thank you, President Baker, I think it's time that the NCAA had some framework within this. We are reactive, not proactive, not thinking ahead of what the issues and problems are, i.e. you mentioned scheduling. Even before the Supreme Court ruling, we should have been looking at that in a proactive way. But as I see this, I look at structure, transparency, and level enforcement. So, Mr. Baker, I had a question for you, but it was in regards to the intersection of congressional action and how the lack of a federal standard was impacting NIL for college athletes, but you've already answered that. So my next question is going to be for Ms. Thole and Ms. Page. There are some who are pushing very strongly to make student athletes employees of their institution. As a current student athlete, would you want to be an employee? Why or why not?
Thank you for the question. I would not want to be an employee of my university. There's multiple reasons and many questions that race through my mind, and some of the first things that come to my head: what if I'm not performing well enough on the field? Can my coaches fire me? I'll have to pay into insurance plans, or will there be a 401k plan? There's so many questions that come to mind. Will I be taxed? Will I lose my scholarship? Will I be paid minimum wage? There's so much that goes into it that I think people need to be careful what they wish for. Thank you for your question. I absolutely would never want to be an employee of my university. There's many reasons about this, but I think this conversation has to shift back to the 5% that this could affect, or could benefit. I'll say it that way, could benefit. The 95% of student athletes, this would be incredibly detrimental to the educational focus of collegiate athletics. Collegiate athletics is a privilege. They were part of the 1% that made it. It's a privilege, and it's also voluntary. So I think that's important to note, as well as the work and time load commitments that would happen with being an employee, as well as the financial sustainability of our universities. I love Radford University, and I know that my counterparts in the Big South, they love their universities, but the financial sustainability of being an employer would be detrimental.
Yeah. And Mr. Griffin, would as an employee of a college, would you be okay with being dismissed or fired?
Well, I think just like every other sports league that makes a similar amount of money or more money than college athletics, for example, the NFL, employee status for athletes works out just fine. And
well, that's exactly why I brought it up, because aren't you then just making college athletics the NFL? So yes, you can be terminated. You can be terminated for performance, terminated at will. So if you don't throw 4 touchdowns, 4 touchdown passes in a game, is that okay for you to be terminated? And what about academic performance? If you're there at college to, partly to play your sport, but also partly to get an education, if you're not academically performing, what happens to that student athlete? Or if you don't show up for class the next day because you're an employee and there to play sports, I feel that there's a little problematic. But as Representative Kamak said, certainly support your right, your entrepreneurship. I really enjoy reading your history and biography on what you've done and what you've been able
to propel. But I've got one more question I want to ask, and that is, Ms. Thole, you detailed your experiences with an NIL contract negotiations in your testimony. From a student-athlete perspective, what role do you think Congress should play in implementing transparency protections for NIL contracts to prevent fraud and deception?
Let's keep this to about 10 or 15 seconds, if you don't mind.
Thank you. I think that the Congress's role is just to make sure that education is brought to all universities so student athletes don't go into situations blind and are confused with their situation.
Thank you very much. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Cardenas.
Thank you very much. Mr. Pfluger, you're just tormenting me. You strike me out every year in our annual game. But here I go. I'm really not an athlete. I just try to play one once a year. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this hearing, and also Member Schakowsky, Ranking Member Schakowsky, for having this hearing as well. It's very, very important that we get this discussion out in front of the public, who I think is just very, very unaware of what's really going on out there, not only with our athletes, but with the NCAA and all the players and participants involved. It's an important topic, and I appreciate this opportunity, and thank you for allowing me to wave onto this discussion. I have an article here on the origins of the NCAA that I'd like to enter for the record, and it's titled, "Why Does the NCAA Exist?" And it talks about how President Roosevelt and some good old boys decided to create the NCAA just over 100 years ago because they loved watching college football. The NCAA's student-athlete model is collapsing because it's built on the faulty premise that college athletes are amateurs. The NCAA wants us to believe that March Madness is no more than a similar pickup basketball games at the local rec center and the NBA Finals, or that the college football playoff is more like a recreational flag football tournament than the NFL playoffs. These notions are absolutely and totally absurd. The reality is that college sports generated $16.6 billion, that's with a B, in tax-free revenue for the 2021 and 2022 school year, making it the second highest revenue-generating league in the world, right behind the NFL in the United States. Mr. Griffin, are athletes competing in the top rungs of collegiate athletics truly amateurs?
Only by payment status, but as far as how we operate, time, effort, and value created, we operate as employees.
Thank you. Professor Jackson, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I'd just like to point out that we've been having a conversation about college sports in a vacuum, and many of these sports are global sports, and the world abandoned amateurism in the 80s, and the sole reason the United States did not was college football. And college football policy, as a result of that, has been the policy for all of the other sports. And so the kind of deleterious consequences of all of this have been playing out. I really appreciated Mr. Vesey's comments earlier about this. So we're tripping ourselves. I mean, we're just confused by the presence or absence of money. And I think we need to get to work. I mean, Chase Griffin shouldn't have to pay for everyone else's experiences. I appreciate that he takes great pride in that, but that's a professional sport.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And in 2022, Division I universities spent 21% of their revenue from athletic activities on facilities and equipment, 20% on coaches' compensation, 18% on compensation for support and administrative staff, 11% on game expenses and travel, and 14% on other expenses. Only 15% of all operating expenses were allocated to athletically related student aid, and a whopping 1% was spent on medical expenses for college athletes at that level. Further, I find it frustrating that under this discussion, draft college athletes would be required to report their NIL-based income, while the NCAA executives, some of them making millions of dollars a year, are not held to the same requirement to disclose their income when they're part of the same ecosystem that you, Mr. Griffin, are part of. Mr. Griffin, is the NCAA and its member universities putting college athletes or their own bottom line first?
I think that Governor Baker introduced a good starting out point and a show of good faith with the proposal. It acknowledged that college athletes, especially in revenue-generating sports, should be paid, should be compensated, and that there's a model that can do this in a way that also reconciles itself with Title IX. And I think by looking at a new model, it also looks at how we approach Title IX. We were talking about how the influx of international college athletes may pose issues for domestic college athletes. I think we look at our Olympic sports and talk to our donors, talk to those, and truly put efforts into fundraising ahead of the LA Olympics coming in 2028.
Thank you. Mr. Baker, would you be in support of the NCAA executives reporting their income as NCAA executives, just like the bill would require that NIL is actually reported on behalf of athletes?
Just one correction, Congressman. I don't think the proposal would have individual athlete compensation. I think it's de-identified. The point behind it was to create a mechanism that would give all student athletes the ability to see what the market looks like generally around what people are making under NIL. Currently, they can't tell.
Okay, and to the question of the
which I think is
NCAA?
important. The answer to your second question is the NCAA is a 501c3 and files an annual report every single year that lists the salaries of all of its senior executives. That's publicly available information.
Good. I'll lift that up and then report it to the committee. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Obernolte.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to thank the committee for allowing me to waive on. This is not a subcommittee that I normally sit on, but this is a very important issue for me. When I served in the California legislature, I was the ranking member of the Committee on Arts, Sports, Tourism, and Entertainment, and I'm struck by the fact that 10 years ago, we had hearings and considered bills on exactly this same topic, and here we are 10 years later, we still have not resolved this issue. Mr. Baker, I would like to ask about something that really concerns me, which is this issue of a patchwork of state regulations, which I know a number of our panelists have mentioned, versus the federal government asserting some primacy and preempting those state regulations. And I mean, here's my concern. We're still seeing states pass legislation in this space. In my own state of California, we just had a bill a few months ago, AB 252, which was the College Athlete Protection Act that did things like, I mean, worthwhile things like establishing a degree completion fund that schools were required to contribute to, giving student athletes rights, which I think were hard to argue against. But the problem is when we do this on a state-by-state basis, my fear is we establish this patchwork of different state regulations and we give unfair advantages to schools that are located in states that have less onerous restrictions. And that affects the competitive landscape among the schools. Is that a concern that you share?
It is a concern, and I'd actually frame it a little differently, which is there are states that literally write rules that are designed fundamentally to make it easier for them to win in the NIL space, which is not the intent of either NIL as it's practiced by Mr. Griffin and by others, but is in fact just a mechanism to benefit schools around recruiting and inducement. I think a lot of what we can do around consumer protections and around transparency and in some respects around institutional involvement in some of these other issues could be very effective at sort of normalizing the competitive playing field. Because even for a conference that's in 4 or 5 states, it gets very hard to create what I would describe as a level competitive playing field on this stuff if everybody's got different rules around how NIL works. But I do think in the end, we're going to need some federal support there, even if it's limited protection, because otherwise, one of the things I've learned in my brief period here is if a member doesn't like a rule that the membership made, it's a federal case, like the next day. And people start spending money on lawyers, and I don't really see how that benefits anybody.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I mean, I think it's pretty clear in our framework of federalism, the entity with responsibility for interstate commerce is this body, the U.S. Congress. And this is pretty clearly interstate commerce when teams from one school are traveling to compete against teams from another school and everyone involved is making money on the process. I think we have an obligation to solve this problem at the federal level. One other question for you, sir. You had talked in your testimony about your opinion that a uniform standard contract would be really helpful in in providing a low-cost, low-effort option to student athletes that perhaps weren't in the high-revenue sports. What's the impediment to implementing something like that?
We're currently in the process of working that through our bylaw process, and I'm hoping to have it in place by the time school starts in the fall of '24. The only impediment might be that I might end up with the membership could vote on it, everybody could agree on it, and then I could have somebody decide that they don't like the way our uniform standard contract is set, and they go to court, file a lawsuit against us and say that this is unfair, when in fact it's designed to actually provide transparency and accountability and responsibility to those agents and to student athletes so that everybody understands what a basic contract looks like. But I could certainly see somebody saying they don't like my basic contract and taking us to court over it.
Sure. Well, I mean, maybe the solution to that is to allow people to opt out. If you don't like the standard, then you can negotiate your own.
Well, that's true too. Good point.
I see I'm going to run out of time. One more thing before I go here. Mr. Jackson, I just wanted to compliment you, sir. Thank you very much for not reading your opening statement. It drives us crazy sometimes when it feels like, panelists read to us, we read our questions back to you. You lose that element of human interaction. I think that's so critical to successful hearings. So thanks for not taking the easy way out there.
Thank you
Mr.
for the
Chairman,
kind
I yield
words.
back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Griffith for his 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me wave onto this important hearing. Mr. Baker, I'm going to associate myself with the comments of Ms. Lesko and Ms. Kamick in relationship to transgender sports. Women ought to be able to compete without men. And I will tell you that one of my local youth leagues, I think, might have actually come up with the right answer. There's a women's division and an open division. And it's kind of an interesting twist on it. But anyway, I pass that on to you, and now I get back to where I plan to go. Ms. Page, thank you for being here. As the congressman who represents Radford University, we're just very proud of what you've done and moving up the ranks, getting involved in the whole process with let me make sure I get the name right, the Student Athlete Advisory Committee, and then starting off at your own school at Radford, which is a wonderful institution, and then moving up. I'm going to ask you a question in a second that I'm going to give you a minute to think about, and then I'm going to do a little Radford ad. And that is, what has not been said or not been said enough at this hearing that you'd like to emphasize? That being said, let me go into my Radford ad. And also let me say thank you to your Director of Athletics at Radford, Robert Leinberg, for being with you today. We appreciate you being here. So Radford's a great college, university. It's in my district. I have a lot of great facilities and universities in my district, but I've always held a little bit of a special place for Radford because I spent a lot of summers there when I was a kid because my single parent mother was getting her master's degree in elementary counseling or elementary guidance, and she didn't have any place for my sister and I, so we hung out at the library or would walk uptown to the Ben Franklin. The Ben Franklin's gone, the library's still there. But I remember those summers with great warmth, and it's a great institution in the mountains of Virginia, not far from the Blue Ridge Parkway and not far from the Appalachian Trail. So anybody who has an interest in that, welcome. So back to you, Ms. Page. One, I would ask you, has your experience been as great as I hope and think most students have at Radford?
It absolutely has been.
That's what I gathered from your actions. Is there anything, now back to that original question, is there anything that you think that we should have focused on more or anything that you'd like to add that either wasn't said yet or wasn't said enough?
Thank you. And thank you for your dedication to Radford University. We really appreciate it. I think one thing that I really want to touch on is just going back to the core values of collegiate athletics, the education and the integrity of what we're doing. I think Ms. Toll did a really good job of talking about how young women and young men and young boys, they look up to collegiate athletics. If we create a model where we're employees, first of all,
You don't feel like an employee, do
I
you?
don't feel like an employee. I don't at all, especially since it's a voluntary thing that we're doing. We get the privilege of playing collegiate sports, and then we get the privilege to make money off of our NIL, rather than it just needing to be awarded to us because we're there. I completely agree with the hard work that collegiate athletes do. I do it myself. But I think that we really need to anchor down on the core values of what we're going about. Our education, I'm getting my education while getting to play my sport, not playing my sport with my education on the side. So I think that's really important for us to continue to talk about the integrity of college sports and the morals behind it. And then also just on an NIL standpoint, I think it's important for individuals to realize that at a mid-major, I personally and my peers are seeking out opportunities. We're not necessarily being sought out for opportunities. So when you're seeking out for an opportunity, it's ultimately so much easier to be taken advantage of. It's so much easier when you don't necessarily have a full staff NIL person at your university at your disposal. Compliance, they work incredibly hard for collegiate athletics, but they can only do so much while managing the rest of an institution. So I think it's really important to realize that mid-majors, not saying that it doesn't happen at the Power Five, not saying it doesn't happen at that level, but at the mid-major, we have to realize that the seeking out provides vulnerability from a collegiate athlete experience. So I think that's really important for us to remember, that we have to protect those student athletes within their exposure as well.
And in the mid-majors and even Division II, you're not in the same league as somebody playing football. No offense to those folks playing football at one of the major universities, UCLA, is Mr. Griffin. Every time they say your name, I go, what? Or even a national champion in a sport that's followed heavily on the Olympics. Whenever the Olympics come up, it's a different world, is it not?
Absolutely, it's a completely different world.
Yeah, I thank you very much and appreciate you, and you've done a great job here today representing your university. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Now I'll recognize Dr. Joyce from Nittany Lion Country, and probably some other schools as well.
Well, thank you, Chairman
Recognized for
Bilirakis, and thank you
minutes.
for allowing me to wave on to this hearing. I would also like to thank your staff and the committee staff for the work that they have done on the Fair College Sports Act ahead of today's hearing. The unique nature of college athletics is something firmly embedded in the American sports psyche, and actually it's embedded in our overall culture. Millions of Americans have been able to attend college and excel both on and off the field because of the opportunities that the NCAA and their membership institutions offer. In the wake of the Alston decision in 2021 and changes to NIL policy, the amateur model that has existed at colleges across our country is now evolving. As legislators, we must examine this issue and the impact of any action that we take, not only on big teams like the Penn State Nittany Lions, my alma mater, but also the ripple effects that this might have for St. Francis University, for Shippensburg, for Juniata College, for Mount Aloysius, for Gettysburg College, all schools with athletics in my district, and the thousands of athletes who compete and go to school at these facilities each and every day. As we hold this hearing today, the NCAA is also facing litigation on a variety of issues, from transfer portal rules, employee status for athletes, to retroactive payments for NIL. President Baker, absent action by Congress, if the NCAA were to lose the House or the Hubbard cases, does the NCAA have a sense of what their liability would be and the impact that would have on member institutions?
I mean, there's a lot of talk about what the impact would be, and there's plenty in the press about it. I would hesitate to comment on that because any number I give you on the record and in a forum like this, I can't.
Do you think there would be
speak to the truth
significant
of.
financial payments that
Pardon
might
me?
occur? Would there be significant financial payments that might occur?
Oh yeah, and it would be applied probably across most of college sports. It wouldn't just be quote unquote the NCAA.
Thank you. At this time, I'd like to enter into the record a letter from D3 Mid-Atlantic Conference Schools on employee status.
Without
Baker.
objection, so ordered.
President Baker, similarly, if a judge is to declare that athletes are employees, such as in the Johnson case, what would that impact be on schools in each division?
Look, I think I've said this before. If you just look at the math associated with the fact that most schools lose money on sports. If you don't have a big TV contract, you're investing in sports and investing in student athletes. Something like the Johnson case would probably, I think it would cost us probably half to two-thirds of all the college sports programs in the country. And the HBCU's letter on this one was incredibly compelling.
So half to two-thirds of college athletics would be discontinued, is
I think
your
that's
answer.
about right, yeah.
What would the impact be on Title IX and collegiate Olympic sports?
I think it'd have a huge impact on Title IX and collegiate Olympic sports because those sports are, in fact, not revenue-producing sports. And schools would have to make really hard decisions about which programs they
And
thought
overall, do you think those sports would be maintained?
No, not at the same level they are now.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the Fair College Sports Act. Section 102 outlines the disclosures required by third parties like boosters and collectives. Specifically, the disclosure requires a signed affidavit that the NIL agreement is not being used as an inducement. President Baker, the NCAA currently has a prohibition against inducements, but it's struggling to enforce this limitation. Do you think it's important that boosters and collectives put pen to paper under penalty of perjury and say that they are not using the NIL agreement as an inducement?
I think one of the most important things we need to do here is to separate what NIL is supposed to be about from inducement. So I think that's a really interesting way to go at it.
Thank you, I agree. With only one case based on undeniable social media evidence being found, is there a need for stronger enforcement, such as the U.S. Intercollegiate Athletics Commission proposed by this committee?
I said to the chairman, I have other ways of thinking about this, which we should probably discuss, but I certainly appreciated the fact that he took a hard run at some very complicated issues in this legislation.
I think we are up to this, and I think we must face this challenge because college sports, as we know them and as we see them, have changed. I'd like to conclude, Mr. Griffith, welcoming you and UCLA to the Big Ten. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and my time has expired.
Thank you. Now I recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger, for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for letting me wave on. Mr. Baker, I think you just referenced a letter from the 4 commissioners that represent the HBCUs. I'd like to enter that letter into the record, which in great detail outlines the negative impact on employment status. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recognize into the record this letter.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Appreciate our student athletes for being here. I was a student athlete at a service academy. We don't do NIL, but we were employees, but it was of the U.S. military. Thanks for being here. Mr. Griffin, I guess I'll start with you. You consider yourself, at this point, an employee. I know there's a lot of hard work that goes into being an athlete, being a student athlete. And you talk about the revenue sharing. Is that your stance? You believe in that revenue sharing? You want the university to consider you as an employee?
Well, I think as far as employee status, I operate as one, but that designation is up to the National Labor Relations Board.
Is that what you do? Are you pushing for that? Do you believe that's the direction we should go?
Well, I think we operate as such, and I do push for revenue share. I think in every other aspect or industry that is making this amount of money off of a talent that produces a product, that talent is compensated fairly. And at the school level, we see that there are students in other departments that are generating that wealth for their schools that are compensated for it. And on the athletic department level, we see that all the way from the athletic director down to the janitor who makes sure that our facilities are clean every day, that they are compensated on a fair market price.
And that fair market is tough. And I'd look to the 2 ladies on each side of you, and I'd ask, I don't know if you know the UCLA softball coach, Ms. Inouye Perez.
Yeah, that's one of my closest mentors.
I wonder if she would, and especially Ms. Thole, who plays softball, if those programs in a way, with good intentions that we have, that's why we're having this hearing, but if we had the employment model, if the revenue sharing were to be implemented, as we've heard the testimony here, and let's say Ms. Thole's program went away, or Ms. Inouye Perez, Coach Inouye Perez's program went away, that's the negative impact that I think we can have here. And that's the testimony we're listening to. I have 3 daughters. I want them to be able to have experiences. They do look up to the 3 of you and other student athletes, but I think student is very important to keep this in. Commissioner Jackson, you've talked about this ad nauseum in your testimony, the concerns that you have. I think you quoted, I'll quote you by saying the rapid collapse of university's ability to field non-revenue generating athletic programs. Do you believe that some of the benefits that you're able to provide student athletes would actually go away and or lead to increased tuition costs?
Without question. I think we would see, especially on the side of women's sports and some of the Olympic sports, they would go from being varsity Division I sports, and if they existed in any way, they would become club sports.
Yep.
That's not the environment that our institutions are looking to provide. We would be contracting and restricting opportunities, and that's not what any of our institutions would like to see.
With a patchwork of state laws that are now governing the way we do this business and creating problems, how important is it, Mr. Jackson, that we do something now? I mean, how
I think
important
preemption is extremely important. I think student athletes should have the ability to see rules and know that they are same regardless if they're being recruited in-state or out-of-state, and have the same expectations of how those rules are going to be implemented.
How important are liability protections to the universities and to the conferences?
I apologize. Could you repeat that?
Liability protections to the universities and to the conferences.
You know, I think it's important, and I've heard President Baker speak to this, that we have the ability to have some help from Congress to make sure that, one, when we're making decisions, we can actually enforce them in some ways, that they can do their job. Because I think, and again, just speaking candidly, sometimes we're his worst enemy. And I say we as members, and allowing them to actually go about and do their jobs. So the help that we can get from this body in making that happen, we would appreciate as the Missouri Valley Conference.
A federal answer to this is very important. As we just noted, Mr. Griffin's school is going to the Big Ten. They're in California. You've got California laws competing with Michigan laws, competing with Texas laws. It's not fair. Congress needs to act right now. We've heard a lot about collectives today. I represent a district in West Texas. Many students go to Texas Tech. Their collective, the Matador Club, has made a commitment to support the entire university. They're doing a very good job, I think. You know, this is where we can come in, and I commend their work. President Baker, in your view, how can collectives better interact with student athletes from those non-revenue generating sports?
I think the most important thing that we were talking about in our Project D1 proposal to make sure that we do a better job of supporting women's sports is to give schools the ability to have a much more direct role in this, which by definition would make Title IX a much more important element to that whole process.
We thank you for being here. This is a tough one, you know, but it is a privilege to play sports in college as a former student athlete myself. But we need to address this. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your work on this, because you are leading the way here. And all three of these student athletes that are here and those that represent the universities and conferences deserve to have an answer from Congress. I appreciate your leadership in trying to get rid of this patchwork of laws, to do it in a very rapid, efficient way, and to have a federal answer that gives some boundaries so that they can compete, they can succeed, and they can go into life being the leaders that we know they are. And with that, I yield back.
We're going to get it done together. And now I want to recognize Mr. Carter, and I'm told by staff, Mr. Carter, that your jacket is out of order.
I'm
But
sorry,
I'll
Mr.
recognize you
Chairman.
for 5 minutes of questioning, good friend.
I would expect nothing less from a Florida Gator than a comment like that, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin, Mr. Chairman,
My friend Steve
echoing.
Spurrier will be proud.
Yeah, he would be.
Yeah.
But I want to echo the comments of Representative Pfluger, and thank you for your work on this. This is
My
extremely
pleasure.
important, and no one has worked harder than the chairman has on this. So thank y'all. Thank all of you for being here. This is extremely important. In case you didn't know, I am a proud graduate of the University of Georgia. Go Dogs! And you know, look, we take our sports very, very seriously, especially football. But all of them. when I was a student at the University of Georgia, it was, you know, I enjoyed the other sports. I enjoyed tennis. I got to see John McEnroe play when he was at Stanford. He played in Athens. I mean, just the experience of, and I can only imagine being a student athlete. Unfortunately, not only was I short, I was also slow, so it didn't work out for me. But nevertheless, it's just a great experience, and we want that to stay, and that's why we're working so hard on this. And the Fair College Sports Act, which is necessary given the current state of the NIL ecosystem, I think it is necessary. We can't continue down the same path. I think everybody recognizes that, and we can't continue down the same path of abuse and the lack of transparency. We talk a lot about transparency here in Congress, and it's extremely important. According to my reading of the bill, Mr. Chairman, there are three possible ways a student athlete could get crosswise with the NCAA. Number one, failure to disclose the student athlete had signed with an agent. Or number two, a failure to disclose that the student athlete had signed an NIL agreement. Or thirdly, a failure to disclose on a quarterly basis the receipt of covered compensation like cash. So, extremely important that we address those things and make sure that this is not going to happen. There are opportunities and guardrails that can enable student athletes to better take advantage of their NIL while facilitating more competitive sports. I'll start with you, Ms. Page. Let me ask you, the NCAA recently adopted many similar requirements such as transparency as part of the recent NIL working group. Why do you think transparency is important in NIL?
Thank you so much for your question. I think transparency is incredibly important in NIL. I've heard President Baker say this a ton of times. We have no idea what the numbers are. So speaking from a personal standpoint, if I were to want to enter into a deal with a company, and once again, kind of going back to what I said before about having to seek out rather than being sought out, I would like to know what another Big South volleyball player is going to make for that deal, and being able to compare and have my own value and be able to negotiate. So I think it's incredibly important since we don't actually know what the numbers are.
Great. Look, I'm a big champion of student athletes receiving compensation for their NIL. And it was a concern when I was in school at the University of Georgia. I graduated in I graduated in 1980. We won a national championship that year, and even then, some of the athletes were, especially football players, are saying, the school's making all this money off of my jersey with my name on it, and I'm not getting any of it. And I understood that point. That's why I'm glad to see this is happening. Commissioner Jackson, I wanted to ask you, how does this bill prevent college sporting events from being akin to some sort of live action commercial or of having payments tied to meeting performance metrics on the field? That has got to be a concern.
I have to be candid. Maybe an example, I'm not really sure I follow.
Well, say somebody has a bad game. Or let me give you an example. What about we played Florida State in the Orange Bowl, and a lot of the athletes didn't even play in that game. I mean, what if, are we going to get to the point where we're requiring them, you got to play in every game, whether you want to or not? Or are there going to be any, how do we prevent something like that from happening?
Again, I'm not quite sure I'm grasping the question, sir.
Well, say a student athlete has got an NIL deal.
Yes.
And that is part of that deal is you're going to meet certain metrics. We got to prevent that, haven't we?
Yeah, I think, I understand what you're saying now. What you're saying, if we get into a situation, an ideal, and student athletes, and actually to be quite candid, we're seeing some of this now, but in a more nefarious fashion. When we have our student athletes participating in ideals, if they're not performing at a certain level, or for example, they drop down in the roster, they don't get compensated. All of a sudden, that NIL becomes fraudulent. So what you're suggesting, and I apologize it took me so long to grasp
I'm sorry.
is very much a danger, because as much as we have good actors and good outcomes, as we're seeing here with Mr. Griffin, we also have bad actors and bad outcomes.
Well, what we don't want to happen is pay for play. I mean,
right.
and that's, I think, what one of our biggest challenges is not to have that. And I want to make sure that we're putting into effect in this bill what we need to in order to prevent that from happening. President Baker, is there anything we can do to prevent that?
I think the proposal that we made, which we call Project D1, which creates an opportunity for D1 schools to basically make NIL a little closer to the campus. I think NIL on the campus would actually be good for women's sports, good for Title IX, and also better for transparency and accountability, but also to give schools the ability to offer enhanced educational benefits to their student athletes. Look, at the end of the day, the most important thing we need for all of this is the stuff that you talked about that was in our bylaw changes around transparency and accountability for students and for those who work with them. And the one thing that would really make that stick would be support from this government so that we can implement those policies and don't end up in court fighting over whether or not we should have policies that make the system more accountable and transparent.
Thank you. I think that's really good advice and exactly what we're looking for. So thank all of you. This is extremely important, especially for for college athletics and for fans like myself. So thank all of y'all for being here.
How do you like the scooter?
Yes, I like it. It gives you an appreciation for people with disability, I will tell you that.
bet,
Yeah.
Well, I thank my good friend from the great state of Georgia. And we're concluding here. I ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents list. In addition to that, we want to include a letter from a student in my backyard attending University of South Florida. Go Bulls. Her name is Sophia, and she plays lacrosse. And she shared her perspective, and we appreciate that very much. So without objection, that will be so ordered. And then I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions for the record, and I ask the witnesses to respond to the questions promptly. Members should submit their questions by the close of business day on February 1st. I want to thank you for being so patient with us. The panel was outstanding, and I thought it was a very productive hearing. So members, again, should submit their questions by the close of business day on February 1st. Without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.